Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a good first day yesterday and you got some time to relax and make some friends after work yesterday. So I'm just going to go through very briefly today's logistics, including the agenda and the planning for meet scientists and other launch activities. First of all, for the agenda, today is the Land and Sea Ice Day. So in the morning, we will have 2 lectures on land modeling, and we will have a lab on XML modifications. And then during lunch, you can have lunch in the cafeteria. You can join one of the private Mesa Lab tour. If you want to go to the tour, let's meet at 12 p.m. at the front entrance. And then if you're one of the meet scientist participants, Elizabeth will send out the assignment during the first break this morning, which is around 10, I think. And then she will also print out a sheet right here. So if you want to sign up afterwards, you can do that too. And in the afternoon, we will have a CIS modeling lecture, followed by another lab exercises on XML modifications. So that's it. Yeah, that's me, the scientist I just told you about. Yes, for today's lab is the XML modification. So basically, on the right there is the rough guideline for the lab throughout the week. So yesterday we did the basics. We learned how to run your first CESM simulation. And today we're going to go through simple XML modifications where you will learn how to modify your run length and run type. And then tomorrow will be name list troubleshooting and source code modifications. And on Thursday, there will be diagnostics. And then on Friday, there will be challenge exercises where you can choose your own area of focus. Although this is a rough guideline of the lab throughout the week, I want to emphasize that this is a self-paced lab, and we all come from different backgrounds and levels of familiarity with the model. So it's completely okay if you move faster or slower. And for today's lab, you can see this is the simple XML modification. We can go through this material all the way to the exercise. Will be 3 exercises, and the expectation is that we go through these 3 exercises to get us familiar with how to change the XML files. Okay, yeah, that means the end of the slides. Any questions about today? Oh, also, I want to make a note that during the lab, you are welcome to use the Damon room, which is on the other side of the library where you can see the little door to the path, to the walking path. We can point you where it is, but you're welcome to use that space as well so that you can be more like spread out. And the afternoon snack will be provided in the Damon room as well. Okay, other questions? Okay, awesome. Then let's get started in the first lecture. Okay. So, great. Our first lecture today is from Will Wieder. He will be talking about representing land in the Earth System 1.
All right, well, I get this mic'd up. If you think about all the components that you learned about the CESM has yesterday, so ocean, sea ice, land ice, atmosphere, land, how many of you identify as land people? That's your primary, yes, this is awesome. Okay, cool. Which still means that more than half the room is, I'm thinking of you as not a hostile audience, but maybe an uninterested audience, especially at 8:30 in the morning. And so this talk will be like part science, part sales pitch. And please feel free to interrupt or ask questions afterwards. If I'm not going into enough depth or if I'm going into too much depth, just be like, hey, like this is over my head. I only care about the MJO, or hey, give me more. I really want to know about snow physics and CLM. Okay. So that's a brief introduction to the land model. I'm Will Wieder, the co-chair of the land model working group, and I'm trained as a soil biogeochemist, which I think I'm the only one at the National Center for Atmospheric Research who actually thinks about soil biogeochemistry. But I'm not going to talk about that today. So Adrianna is going to talk about biogeochemistry, and I'm going to talk about biogeophysics. And if there's one feature of modeling at NCAR or within CESM, and especially in the land model, it's that we all kind of have our expertise, but we are pulled in lots of different directions. And so even though I'm not a physicist at all by training, that's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay. And so in terms of why, like thinking about land in an Earth system model, I want to talk about why we do it in the first place, how we do it, and then some of the future directions for the land model working group. And then I also want to acknowledge that I think maybe you talked a little bit about the working groups yesterday, but the land model working group is kind of my home, and that's where I spend the community I spend a lot of time with. So a huge group to the land model working group. Previous co-chairs were Dave Lawrence and Gordon Bonin. And so their leadership has been pretty instrumental here. The whole land model working group software engineering team is critical to the kind of software and user experience that we provide for you guys. So thanks to Eric and the rest of that team. And then the liaisons currently are Keith Olson and Sam Levis. So when you post questions on the bulletin board, it'll be Keith and Sam that start fielding those questions. And then if you have particular questions that is kind of outside their area of expertise, it might be Adrianna or me or Daniel or somebody else who responds. Okay. All right, so one of the kind of critical things that the land provides is land-atmosphere interactions, and so that's, I think, kind of best represented by this figure from Randy Koster that's 20 years old now, or more than 20 years old. But this idea that that there's some sort of inherent predictability of atmospheric processes based on conditions on the land surface is kind of a critical feature that land models provide within the CESM context. And so these regions that are kind of highlighted are regions that are thought to show some sort of predictability, where if you know something about the antecedent soil moisture state, you can predict the likelihood of future precipitation events. So, you know, if the kind of dust belt or this kind of part of the central U.S. or the Sahel is wet, it's likely to produce more rainy conditions on average. And so this idea of land-atmosphere interactions is really critical for the science that CESM does, and a really important component of, or important feature of what the land model is trying to contribute. Another kind of question that I'm interested in is thinking about how water management in places like the Western U.S. is really, snowpack is critical for that. And so what you can see here in the picture is that kind of the water towers, the natural water towers that we have in the Rocky Mountain West in this figure are very highly predictive of how much runoff we'll see in the winter. And so what's shown on the blue lines is that, you know, this is from the CESM2 large ensemble. You can have lots of varying years with different snowpacks, but that snowpack is very strongly predictive of the runoff that you see the next spring and summer. And so our water systems in the West are really built on this. We have a bunch of observational systems like SNOWTEL, which are used to measure snow to then predict runoff forecasts. And then what's shown in orange is how that predictability kind of falls apart in future simulations. So again, this is from the CESM2 large ensemble. So it's running with SSP 370, and you can see that there's much less predictability of snow on runoff. And so thinking about kind of water resources is a critical feature that models like CLM and CESM can provide. And then one more example is thinking about land use and land coverage change. So this is, again, a 20-year example from Kathy Hibbard using CAM3 and CESM3, but it's looking at the change in annual 2-meter temperature in degrees Celsius for a simulation that plants trees all over the whole world versus one that's bare ground. And so you can see that just by changing the land surface, you get warming over the continents, which you might expect in the northern hemisphere, but then that has offshore impacts because of teleconnections. And the reverse is true in the tropics, where adding trees to the land surface actually cools the temperature because of evapotranspiration, and that actually cools the oceans kind of downwind of that. So thinking about land, you can't actually plant trees all over the whole planet. If we wanted to, you couldn't. It wouldn't be successful, but you can do that in the model. So you can do these kind of idealized experiments to think about how land properties affect the Earth system. That's not just kind of an intellectual thought experience. We're actually doing this at large scales, and any of you who flew over big sections of the Midwest to get here, or other, any other part of the world. When when you take off, you'll see these crop circles, and this is, people ask, like, why is it all in circles? And so we use center pivot agriculture to irrigate a lot of these fields, and so there's a big pump in the middle and a sprinkler that basically goes in a giant circle. So that's what's causing this. But depending on the crops that are here, whether it's winter wheat, spring wheat, corn, soybeans, you can get very different colors, even within one of these giant sphere or giant circles. And that'll green up at different times. And so those changes in color, that real world color, also change the albedo, so they'll change energy fluxes. And then they also change carbon dynamics. And so we actually have explicit agriculture and agricultural management in CESM. That's not something I'm going to talk a ton about today, but it's a cool feature of the model. I think we're the only Earth system model still that explicitly represents agriculture and agricultural management. And Adrianna, I'll talk a little bit about that. Anyway, so agriculture is one real-world example of how we're physically changing how the land surface looks. That has important kind of climate and biogeochemical and biogeophysical feedbacks. There's some other things that are happening because of the actions that we're taking on land, and so these are kind of remote. But there's evidence for Arctic greening across wide swaths of the Arctic, where you can see plants greening up and staying green for longer as snow melts earlier, and summers are longer. And then that's also those warming temperatures in the Arctic are causing these permafrost changes, which cause kind of wide-scale geomorphological changes on the Earth's surface. So again, thinking about changes in phenology and then also changes in subsurface subsidence and hydrology associated with permafrost thaw are some other features that we can think about in CESM. And then lastly, deforestation and forest fires are things that have obvious impact on our ability to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, and then also in terms of the radiative effects that forest and fire emissions have are some critical features that the land plays. And so this kind of, I don't know if Dave showed some variant of this hub and spoke diagram, but the community Earth system model, you can think about these things like land-atmosphere interactions, climate variability, air quality, climate change and weather, and really CLM and the land model working group are critical to that. But then the CLM and the land model working group serve these other communities that are more focused on kind of social impacts, hydrology, ecology, biogeochemistry, the cryosphere, and then agriculture and forestry. So we're really trying to kind of thread the needle between kind of providing lower boundary conditions for the atmosphere and kind of the things that CAM needs, but then also serving these broader communities that are thinking about kind of more land processes in general. Okay, so I asked ChatGPT to draw a picture of what the land model in CESM does, and this is what it came up with, which I actually kind of liked because it kind of communicates this idea of hydrology. We actually have an urban model also, so we do think about the built environment and how changes in building properties and the extent of urban areas affects climate and local temperatures. And then we think about natural systems as well, and agriculture and water. So kind of the motivation for me in thinking about land modeling CESM is that land is really the critical interface through which humanity affects and is affected by global environmental change. And so what we're trying to do in the land model working group is represent land biogeophysics, especially hydrology, plant physiology, biogeochemistry, and then land use change, agricultural management, and ecosystem dynamics, as well as urban environment. So it's a ton, and that's why like none of us are experts in any of these things, but we try to do all of them. So it's a fun place to come play if you're interested in kind of these broad questions. Okay, that's my sales pitch. Any questions, like quick questions before we dive into some of the nitty gritty? Okay. So there's kind of three main things that effectively the land model has to do. We have to think about exchanges of momentum, water, CO2, dust, and other trace gases between the land and atmosphere, and then as well as we're coupled to a river model, which is called, depending on what configuration of the model you're using, one of three river models. So that considers runoff to the ocean. So we are fully coupled in terms of thinking about delivering water back to the ocean. Aside from those exchanges, then we're also constantly kind of updating the states of the land surface, so things like soil moisture, soil temperature, We keep track of canopy temperature, snow on the land surface and in the canopy, carbon and nitrogen stocks, both in vegetation and in soil. And then we think about characteristics of the land surface. So how does the physical representation of what's on the land influence things like soil texture, which influences hydraulic and thermal properties, surface roughness, which interacts with the atmosphere, as well as albedo, emissivity, vegetation type, and leaf area index, which are all changing over time. So it's a really dynamic system that responds to and then also influences the state of the atmosphere. This is kind of the canonical drawing. If you go to, so Dave Lawrence wrote the sort of CLM5 overview paper, which was published in 2019. If you really want to get into the details, I'd suggest that you go either to our GitHub page, which has a lot of this information in the tech note and user's guide, as well as Dave's paper, which kind of documents the kind of key features of CLM5, which is what I think you guys are using. Are you guys using CSM 2.1 or 2.2 in the tutorial? Just 2, CSM 2. Okay, so this is still representative of what's in the model that you're working on. And a year from now, if you come back to the tutorial, we'll have released CLM 6, and there will be some kind of polishing around the edges, but the core of this will still be consistent. Okay, so we think about biogeophysics and biogeochemistry. It looks like this slide got messed up in the conversion. But biogeophysics is kind of everything on the left-hand 2 panels. So I was thinking about surface energy, fluxes, and hydrology. And then Adrianna will talk a little bit more about biogeochemistry, which is more the right-hand side of this figure. Okay, so we'll kind of dive in a little bit to surface energy fluxes. So at each time step, CLM solves the surface energy balance, which is kind of the balance of incoming and outgoing shortwave radiation, as well as incoming and outgoing longwave radiation. Then we also consider latent heat, evaporation, ground heat fluxes, and sensible heat fluxes. And all of this is kind of then it's dependent on both the vegetation that's there, the snow that might be covering it, the water films that are kind of held in the canopy, as well as the conditions of the soils underneath. So there's a bunch of energy fluxes that we balance, and kind of importantly, we balance the surface energy budget at 30-meter time steps. So, some people have come to the tutorial and asked, like, hey, I'm really just interested in carbon cycles. Like, can't I use a model like Century or Daycent to do kind of to answer the questions that I'm in? And that's totally true if you're just interested in carbon cycle questions. But we're core to what the land model is doing is balancing the surface energy budget at every time step, and that's something that a kind of ecosystem or biogeochemistry model doesn't necessarily do. And on top of it, we're also balancing the water budget, and so precipitation then is balanced by soil evaporation, transpiration, and canopy evaporation. So these 3 fluxes of water off of the land surface, as well as runoff from the subsurface. And then we also look at changes in soil moisture, snow state, canopy. I can't remember what this one even is. That's not a good sign. SC, not sure. Anyway, there's another bucket somewhere in here. Snow, I'm not sure what it is. That's all right. Oh, surface water and canopy water. Okay. So again, we're balancing kind of the fluxes of water to and from the land surface. Okay, there it is, biogeophysics in 2 slides. I'm sure it's all clear. The quiz is coming up. That's not really a joke. Okay, so this is a quote from Randy Koster, where he said, the ability of the land surface scheme to model evaporation correctly depends on its ability to model runoff correctly. The 2 fluxes are intricately related through soil moisture. And so there's this idea that, one of the important things that the land does is represent things like runoff, which is important if you send your kid to a camp in Texas and you want to know when runoff's happening. That's really, really important. And also evaporation is important to know, like, how much soil moisture or how much evaporation is coming from the land surface. And the balance of those two fluxes is thought to be really critical. And so as you get a little bit more moisture in the system, you can get a lot more evaporation and not that much more runoff until you hit this critical threshold where you can't evaporate any more water. And so it's all going to go to runoff instead. But Randy's missing something in this statement. And can anyone guess what it is? So that, like with this kind of dichotomy between runoff and evaporation, what's he missing? Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Yes! Plants! Plants are so important. And so we think about this like blue marble, but actually we live on a green earth, and it's green because of plants. So blue water is important, getting runoff is important, but the green water here is critical because that's the kind of balance, it's the plants that are, it's what the plants don't get is what comes off in runoff. Okay, so plants are really, really, really critical, and it happens at a cellular scale on the bottom of a leaf. And so this is my really quick introduction to plant physiology. I'm also not a plant physiologist, so it'll be simple. So here's a tree, there's a leaf. On the bottom of a leaf are these tiny, tiny mouths. And I'm doing this with my hands because like when they open the mouth, it's called a stomata or stomates. The stomate opens up, and that's how plants effectively breathe with the atmosphere. So they send water out, and they trade that water for CO2. So the plant has to open its stomates to get CO2 inside the leaf for photosynthesis, but in doing that, it also is losing water. So that exchange is really important, and balancing that stomatal conductance is a critical part, again, of what we're trying to do in a model like CLM. So that exchange is important for biogeochemistry and the photosynthesis that happens, but in terms of the biogeophysics of the model, it's mostly critical for the water that's exchanged in that kind of trade of CO2 in and water out of the cell. So plant physiology is really, really important for controlling transpiration and CO2 exchange. And it's a function of solar radiation, humidity or vapor water deficit in the atmosphere, soil moisture, CO2 concentrations both in the atmosphere and in the intercellular space of the leaf, temperature, leaf temperature, and then also leaf nitrogen concentrations. Okay. So when you're running CESM, this is kind of quickly diving into details. You can run with the biogeophysics only mode, which we call SP or satellite phenology. So when you create a case, oftentimes those you'll define the CLM physics package, so CLM5 or CLM6, and then you'll also define whether you want to run out of the box an SP simulation, which again just stands for satellite phenology, which means you're only focused on the biogeophysics, so you're only interested in water, water energy momentum fluxes. And so that kind of turns on certain features in the model. So you've got photosynthesis and stomato resistance because plants are important. You've got hydrology, snow, soil thermal properties, and then also surface albedo and radiative fluxes. But you're not doing all the biogeochemistry. So you're doing this kind of leaf level gas exchange that we're talking about here, but that's as far as the carbon cycle goes, is just you're only getting photosynthesis or GPP, gross primary productivity. And then if you want to turn on the biogeochemistry, there's a lot more science that has to happen then. The runs are more expensive. Again, this is what Adrianna is going to talk about. But when you turn on a BGC comp set, then you're going to start representing prognostically the vegetation, carbon and nitrogen pools. You'll start thinking about phenology in explicit ways. Also plant mortality, which is kind of very simple in CLM, decomposition, the nitrogen cycle, and methane. For both of these, all this other stuff is turned on too. So there's the urban model is on. Crops are represented kind of simply in an SP mode and much more explicitly with a biogeochemistry comp set. We have lakes, so you get evaporation off of lakes. Fires and fire emissions actually are only in biogeochemistry. Dust emissions are all the time. So if you're interested in seeing how changes in the land surface affect atmospheric chemistry and dust emissions, you can do that. There's a BVOC model, biogenic volatile organic compounds model called MEGAN that gives you things like monoterpenes and isoprene emissions to the atmosphere that are important for chemistry. The glaciers and ice sheets work within the land model. Then there's also river flow, and then vegetation tomography is kind of a special case where there's another model that you can turn on called FATES, but I'm not going to talk about it all here. Kind of the point is, like, the simplest thing to do is run in SP mode, because it means you're not going to get as many things wrong, because we're telling the plants when, where, and how many leaves they have, and so you're not going to have to worry about, the Sahel not greening up because precipitation biases in the model. We're going to make the Sahel green whether or not it should be or not. So running with SP mode is nice, but it's the simplest way that you can run CLM or CESM. Okay. So I kind of want to emphasize how important plants are for the land model, because it's really the only, it's a unique characteristic in CESM that we're actually representing vegetation like this. And so, if you've got a forest, it's obviously affecting the shortwave radiation in terms of how dark the leaves are. It also affects the long wave radiation, sensible heat fluxes and latent heat fluxes. So these are kind of the core pieces of balancing the terrestrial surface energy budget. And so when you change, if you make the canopy lighter, it'll affect albedo and shortwave radiation. If you make the canopy shorter, it affects roughness length and then your sensible heat fluxes. And then if you change how conductive that canopy is, if you make it evaporate more or less water, that affects evapotranspiration and your latent heat fluxes. So anytime you have a change in plants, it can result in a change in the surface energy budget, which I think is one of the more fascinating things that experiments that we're doing in the land model working group and the biogeochemistry working group are looking at how changes in plants, and especially plant physiology, influences climate. So there's all these uncertainties about how you represent vegetation, and we know that changing plants will change the surface energy budget, which influences climate. And that happens in different ways in different parts of the world. So this is kind of taken from a couple papers that Gordon wrote. The most recently came out last year. But looking at tropical forests, they're big, so they've got a lot of they're tall, so they have a high roughness length. They also tend to be dark, and they absorb lots of CO2. They also produce lots of biogenic aerosols, so BVOCs, whereas boreal forests, tend to be snow-covered more of the time. The incident radiation is lower, the canopy is shorter, and they exchange kind of less turbulent fluxes of energy, and then also CO2 and atmosphere and water with the atmosphere. So depending on kind of characteristics of the forest, that it'll have different climate impacts depending on where you are. And kind of the interesting thing is this is still uncertain science about how changing forests actually changes climate, and it's kind of still being hotly debated, which is interesting. And then on top of that, there's this local response, which is kind of easy to think about, but then the large-scale atmospheric circulations and teleconnections that result from that are where it gets kind of mind-blowing in terms of the remote response that you have from that. But again, these are the kind of questions that CESM lets you think about. I think another unique feature of the land model is how we think about land surface heterogeneity. And so, like I said, we have an urban model, which is kind of this urban canyon model that represents changes in building properties and building densities and phenomena like the urban heat island and human temperature stress and human temperature exposure. We have a crop model, this dynamic vegetation model called FATES. We interact with glaciers, and then we also have wetlands and lakes. So all of this is happening within a single CLM grid cell, and we'll kind of dive into what that looks like in a minute. So at the grid cell level, it's split into land units. So there's vegetated land units, lake, urban, glacier, and crop. And then within a vegetated land unit, there's columns. And those columns you can think of as like a soil pet-on. If you went out and like looked at, long view, looked at a soil column, that's kind of what it would look like. And then on top of that soil column, there's all these patches. And those patches are different vegetation. And so they're, here they're just labeled PFT 1 through 4. But we've got 16 natural PFTs and then a whole bunch of crop PFTs that we represent. And each of those, the natural vegetation shares a soil column. And then all of the crop PFTs are on individual soil columns so that you can have irrigated corn and rain-fed corn within the same grid cell, but they're on different columns so that the non-irrigated one doesn't steal the water from the irrigated one. I think I said that right. Then also fertilizer. So we can apply fertilizer to some crops, but not all of them. And again, because they're on their own soil column, it kind of keeps the management practices onto that subgrid tile. It also means that if you're really interested in knowing what soybean production was over the whole US, you have to kind of get into this patch level output or PFT level output, which are on different history files. I'm not going to go into that here, but there's, you can look at a grid cell average, but that grid cell average is kind of the weighted sum of a whole bunch of little patches that we're kind of keeping track of. And then people that are smart, like Bill Sachs, help us make sure that we're conserving energy, water, and carbon fluxes as we go through land use changes. And so what you can kind of see here is that basically the green patches are getting smaller and the yellow patches are getting bigger with land use change. And so we're reducing some of the forest and some of the native grasslands and replacing those with crops over time. And so that happens dynamically. The same thing happens for the urban environment now. We have a transient urban data set that lets us build cities over the 20th century. Okay, so zooming back out, we have four main focuses, I would say, in the land model working group. One question is where are we going to put the carbon? How are we going to grow the food? And are we going to maintain enough water to produce that food and to maintain the ecosystem services that we have or that we want? And then we also consider about the urban environment. And so we have some features that, again, I'm not going to go into, but FATES is the ecosystem demography model that will kind of be the future of CLM moving forward. We have a crop model that's active in our CMIP runs. So that lets us think explicitly about food and food production. There's a new feature called the hill slope hydrology model, which also lets you think about subgrid variability in terms of hydrology and hydrologic connectivity, which if you're interested in those types of questions, grab me at lunch or another one of the land people here, because we can talk about the hill slope hydrology model, and then CLMU, or the urban model, I think is another cool feature that's novel in CMIP class of models that we have. And so in CESM3, we've got kind of some big targets that we're hitting. And so one is that, I don't know if you guys talked about it all yesterday, but in CESM3 and for CMIP7, emissions-driven simulations are kind of the core of what we're doing. That's a capability that CESM has had for almost 20 years, but that's going to be central here, which is to say that we're not going to tell the model what CO2 concentrations are in the atmosphere. We're just going to say, here's what anthropogenic CO2 emissions are, and then the model has to figure out how much of those emissions ends up in the atmosphere, how much of it comes back on land, and how much of it ends up in the ocean. So that emissions-driven focus is going to be a core feature for the release. We're hoping to be able to run with interactive fires, I should say interactive fire emissions. So we have a fire module in CESM. That fire will burn vegetation and then send the emissions to the atmosphere. That's again a feature that Peter Lawrence and others have been working with CESM2, but we're hoping to make that core for what we're doing in CESM3, and that's a big reach. I don't think any other Earth system model is run with interactive fires for CMIP simulations. We have updated surface data sets, which is like the first time in 15 years that we've updated surface data sets. Then there's a new dust scheme, a new roughness scheme. There's updates to snow optical properties, which is called the Snicker model. We're representing excess ice in permafrost systems, which is important again for kind of thermal capabilities or thermal properties of soil. And then updates to crop calendars, which will hopefully reduce some of our crop model biases relative to what they were in CESM2. A huge effort for the land model working group is in some of our calibration capabilities and looking at trying to quantify some of the land parameter uncertainty. So Linnea Hawkins and Daniel Kennedy are kind of leading a big push to look at parameter uncertainty. Like I said, we do have a transient urban data set now, which lets us look at transient urban extent and kind of the role of the urban heat island in changing landscapes, I guess. As well as capabilities to run with transient hill slope in the hill slope model, as well as transient fates. And when I say transient, this is just like a historical simulation where we have changes in land use and land cover change. So hill slope and fates won't be on by default in CESM3, but they will be features that you can run with either in land only or in coupled model simulations. did it. Okay. Now we have more time for questions. Thanks.
Questions for Will? Are there any updates to the irrigation scheme in CESM3, and in particular, does it fix how in South Asia it's applied during the season? Do you know?
So the crop calendar work addresses, like in CSM2, we couldn't grow rice in India. It's a problem. So the crop calendar scheme makes it so that we're planting rice at the right time. The irrigation scheme is simple in the sense that it basically, like, if you're irrigating rice, then it applies the water, as much water as the plants need when they need it. But it's pretty simple. Yeah, so the water isn't prescribed, but the planting would be. I think you'd have to look to see if it makes sense. But I'm optimistic that the crop calendar scheme, which kind of gives us a planting window that's appropriate for the region, at least will get us closer to right.
Thank you.
We still don't do things like flood irrigation, which would be great to have.
Question for
Yeah.
Hi. How accurately does the CSM represents the partitioning of the latent heat flux and sensible heat flux?
There tends to be a bias in the Bowen ratio. I can't remember which way it goes. Do you remember? I think it biases. It has a high bias in latent heat flux relative to flux tower observations. But it might be the other way around. I can't remember. But that's something that we pretty consistently see. And I've asked Gordon about it, and he's like, "Yeah, it's always been like that." But it's something that you can, something you can work on. I guess something else I should have said. I kind of pitched this to running thinking about CESM and running coupled model simulations. But one of the nice things about the land model is you can run it just for a single grid cell, or just for kind of basically a point. So you can run it in kind of column mode if you're thinking like single column mode if you're an atmospheric person, or just a chunk of land. It's something that's kind of unique for many of the other components. You can't run the ocean model basically just for a grid cell because there's too many interactions nearby. But the land model, all you need is the atmospheric conditions for that point. You can run it in kind of a point mode. Oh, sorry, there's a lot of questions. Go ahead.
I wonder if you want to run the one grid cell,
Yeah.
and then how's gonna be the time resolutions would be?
Still 30
just
minutes.
Output a few minutes or hourly output or?
I mean, you can ask for whatever. Usually, if you're running, I'll typically run at a flux tower site, so then we get 30-minute output, which is useful to compare to.
Okay, so we can get the diurnal cycle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like right now in the tutorial, you're just getting monthly averages or whatever. And so, you can turn on higher frequency output up to 30 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. I was thinking if you're gonna look at the end, so it's like it's fire. So how is the capability of this model for predicting fire? Because it's a lot of things changes, like vegetation changes. It's like gonna be changes in so many ingredients for the fire.
Yeah.
I was thinking, how is this model comparable to the fire models?
I think in things like FireMIP, which is the model in comparison for fire models, I think CESM does okay. It's very highly calibrated. The model that we're using in CESM2 and also in CESM3 is really highly tuned to GFED. And whether you use GFED as a satellite-derived fire product, and so whether you use GFED4 or GFED5, you get very different answers in terms of burned area, which is kind of the big metric that we're looking at. CESM2 had a really low bias at high latitudes. Like we didn't have boreal fires in CESM2, and so that's something that Feng Li's tried to address in CESM3. CESM3 is still a work in progress, so I can't really tell you how we're doing. But we're trying to do better. Fates uses a different fire model, which is called Spitfire, and I think Spitfire is a little bit more, it's not as highly calibrated, but it hopefully has better process representation. And so you kind of, I don't know, when you peruse process representation, you often can lose in other ways, but you're getting the wrong answer for more right reasons sometimes. Back in the corner.
For paleo models, do
Yeah.
you tune against pollen records at all? And
Yeah, paleo is a really tricky application. A lot of times we'll run paleo with different PFT distributions than what we have present day. And for really old paleo climates, like the distribution, like the land mask is different. So you've got continents in different places with different plants growing in different places. There's no satellite record, so I don't know if they run with satellite phenology. I think they tend to run with biogeochemistry. But it's always like a niche. It's always really hard to run different paleo applications. There is a lot of interest in running Fates paleo applications too, and I don't know if Sophia is helping at all in the tutorial, but Sophia's work with has been really critical in developing some of these capabilities. So yeah, it's something we think about, and it's always really hard. And that's part of why we have 3 river models, is because to run paleo, we tend to have to run with RTM, which is an older river model, but it still works for paleo stuff.
can I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
Looking at more kind of recent, late glacial history, are there any regions that do really well in CESM in predicting the vegetation changes, or regions that do really poorly?
So so if you're wanting to predict vegetation changes, to me, that means you're running with Fates, because that's a model that lets you have dynamic vegetation. And I don't know, do you know of any? I keep looking at Adrianna, because she's a Fates developer.
I don't know if anybody's done that. So.
I don't know.
You should do that,
Yeah.
whoever you are.
I think that's I guess another
That would be
thing I'll
really
just
cool.
kind of encourage is like, there's so few of us
Yeah.
that are actually here doing land model development that we really rely on the university community to like do cool science for us. And so that's an awesome question.
Yes.
I have no idea.
Please do that.
I think Fates is like, Fates is trying to get the vegetation to grow in the right places at the right time, and so that's a part of like thinking about paleo applications is a really good test of that. Yes.
Yes, for the hill slope
Yeah.
hydrology, did you mention you kind of represent the subgrid scale
Yeah.
elevation? Do you like smoothen elevation maps or something, or how do you?
It's very, I have a great, this is the simplest figure I think I might have. Okay, so here's a really blurry grid cell, and this is gonna be my 1 dig at high resolution. So this is like, maybe this is a 1 degree grid cell, and we wanna go to high res, like we wanna do 1/4 degree or 1/10 of a degree or whatever. Great, like you just made your model 16 times more expensive, and you didn't actually resolve the processes that are there, so that's why we wanna do it, is because going to high res on the land surface doesn't really help us that much. And so then, oops, sorry, this is too many innovations. So then what we actually do is in one of those grid cells, you can have upland columns and lowland columns that are hydrologically connected to one another, and then like a riparian area or a river in the bottom. And so that's kind of, so water would run downhill, which it does, but then we also partition, so the energy is partitioned into north and south facing hill slopes. You get higher incoming solar radiation in the northern hemisphere on south facing hill slopes than you would on north facing hill slopes, which is important. And then we also kind of statistically downscale the precipitation and temperature so that it's colder at higher elevations, colder with more snow at higher elevations, and warmer with more rain at lower elevations. But it's very simple in how we represent it. It's just by adding more columns.
Okay, and so it only works for kind of drainage to the ocean, or does it also?
Well, that's just within a grid cell, and then the grid cell would be connected to the river model. So I think for these high res things like what's shown in the upper right there, we use a different river model. It's called Mizuroute, and Mizuroute then would be connected to the ocean.
But so is there like some kind of lateral flow as well between the grid cells?
Not between, well, only between grid cells through the river.
Yeah,
There's still no between grid cell transfers, it's just within grid cells.
Right.
That we're thinking about.
Yeah, okay, cool.
That's a good question.
first.
Yeah.
Are there plans to include like a groundwater model?
We used to have groundwater and we took it out. So CLM4 had a groundwater model, and CLM5 we took it out. And I don't know of any plans to put one back in.
So some of the improvements that you mentioned for like the future version of the model, like crop calendars and all this, sounds like very complex processes. So to what extent does it make to what extent does it like affect I don't know, uncertainties and I don't know, like to what extent does it, I guess, make improvements on a like large scale when it's like a fully coupled model when you correct like these very small processes?
That's a really good question. I mean, so crop, I'll just pick on the crop calendar example. Like, it's actually not a small change because in CSM2 we didn't grow rice in India, which if we actually had to feed people in India, that would be a problem. But more in terms of like there's large areas that should have been green at certain times of the year that weren't, and so it probably did affect. It definitely affected carbon. It probably also affected water and energy fluxes for that region too. So there could be some regional biases that we're hoping to address with this crop calendar issue. But I think more broadly, your question kind of points to the challenges of like, well, do you really need a crop model and a land model that's really just supposed to be the bottom boundary conditions for the atmosphere? And you could argue that point, like, really maybe all we need is a simple land model and like 3 people in the land model working group because we're only serving like the greater good of CAM. But I'd argue that no, we actually are trying to serve like a really wide variety of people, and so we want to build tools that are useful for the community, and so that's where adding some more sophistication does increase our uncertainty, but it also lets us ask more questions. So yeah, I think we're often wrestling with that problem when we think about what our priorities are in the working group. That's a good question. Behind you. Yeah, and then we'll come to you.
So this might be a really simple question. I'm not a land person, but so you said the boreal forests weren't catching fire. What causes how do you make a fire happen in the model? Like what is triggering that?
So lightning is the first part, and we run right now with just one of the biggest data sets that we have is this lightning data set that's produced by NASA, and it's just a 1-year climatology of lightning, and we use that in perpetuity, so all the way till 2300 in some runs. That's the first, so first you need a spark, and then you need conditions on the ground, so we do track things like fuel wetness loads, and if the fuels are like, basically if it's drier, then probabilistically you're more likely to have a fire.
With the spark, is it kind of like a random probability of like, we know that this is when or where lightning strikes happen.
Yeah.
There's a 1 in 100 chance that this lightning strike will start
Fire
Okay.
and burn a little bit. Fires in the, like, it's like, oh cool, you have a fire model, but fires in the model also only burn for a day. They only like trim the canopy basically, so, and you can also have ignitions from like deforestation, and from agriculture, so there's all these other sources of ignitions, but in boreal forests, right now there's not a lot of deforestation and there's no agriculture. So for boreal forests, it's just lightning. And if there is a fire, you don't get these zombie fires that overwinter in the model. They only burn for a day. They only like basically trim the canopy, like shave off like some vegetation, and they don't change other surface properties. So you don't have like a blackened surface that then would change albedo over huge areas. It's basically just an instantaneous, like 1-day flux of carbon to the atmosphere, and then the other emissions that might go with that. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'll come to you in a second.
Is this type of like column approach account for like a land feature changes? For example, like a river rerouting?
We don't typically think about rivers rerouting. The only parts of the land surface that typically change in the model are the vegetation that's there, the crops that might be planted on it, and now the urban extent. So we don't allow for meandering rivers to my knowledge, but that's really interesting.
Out of curiosity, do you consider fires over tundra and permafrost rather just than like the vegetated areas like forests?
Yep, they should happen there.
Okay.
In reality, I think we need to look and see if they are.
But are they being represented in the models?
So yes, there were like the in CSM2 large ensemble, there were changes in high latitude fires that people have looked at. Again, it's a very the fire model in CSM2 was okay, but maybe not fit for purpose for these high latitude questions. But it doesn't keep people from looking. Oh my gosh, there's so many.
You mentioned the 1 by 1 degree. So let's say you're running the model and you have an urban center within the grid cell.
Yeah.
So do you just, I'm just thinking, do you just assign like a percentage of the grid cell to be urban? And how, when you grow it out, you increase the percent of the urban area?
Yeah, so it really depends on your question. You can either pick the grid cell that is older and say we're going to run with that surface data set that has partial urban and partial cropland and partial forest for that grid cell, or you can say I'm going to change that grid cell and make it all urban, or I'm going to make it all forest or all cropland. And it really just kind of depends on your application. So if you want to, users have a lot of control over what the surface properties look like and how they change over time. We kind of give you an out of the box, here's how it looks, and you can either pick that suggestion, or if you want to change it because it's inaccurate for your purpose, you can.
Another question. So 1 by 1 degree, is that too coarse? Like, for example, we're talking about, earlier you're talking about soil moisture and probably how it interacts with the atmosphere and stuff. So, and you mentioned about, how soils can trigger like convections and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Can that really be resolved within that resolution? Or I guess the main question I'm trying to ask, what is the minimum or maximum resolution that the CLM can run at to resolve like those?
Yeah, so Adam's doing some, I don't remember if they're 1/4 degree or 10th degree runs. They must be 10th degree runs, which are crazy high res and really expensive. Again, it's very question dependent. Like, we do it at 1 degree because that's what we can run climate scale simulations on, but you might indeed want higher resolution for certain questions. If you have a bunch of computing time, you can really okay. So yeah, the model, that's I guess another feature of CLM compared to the other models is that our parameterization isn't resolution dependent. So we're not trying to resolve mesoscale haze or something in CLM, and so we don't have different parameterizations based on the resolution.
Okay, we ran out of time.
I'll be around so you guys can grab me.
Yes, you can find Will at the break. Okay, go into the break and come back at 9:30.
Set us up with some biophysics. So now I'm going to talk about, it's not. Okay, great. With biogeochemistry and ecosystems. Okay, so I know Will did the land people. Raise your hands. How many of the land people or otherwise are biogeochemists? What about ecologists? Okay, hey. All right, there's a couple of you. Okay, all right. So again, yeah, part of my job is to get you excited about land biogeochemistry. In CESM, this is mostly the carbon cycle, a little bit of the nitrogen cycle. The ocean model cares a lot about a lot of the other elements, but on land, we mostly deal in carbon and nitrogen. Living things are mostly just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a relative ratio of CH2O, so just bags of carbon and water. Yeah. Okay, so again, I'm going to follow the same format. I'm going to look at why, how, and some future directions. Yeah, so why? Okay, so science, we often, science is driven by these like big fundamental questions that organize and focus the efforts of researchers. So like in astronomy, how did the universe begin? In physics, what comprises matter? In biology, how did complex organisms arise from single cells? In ecology, we want to ask, how do ecosystems change when the climate changes? And this really requires the synthesis of like all we think we know. So like physiology of plants and animals, population and community ecology, ecosystem productivity and element cycling. And like Will said, this is still kind of uncertain. We still don't have a complete answer. And so obviously this climate ecosystem question is really relevant today given climate change, but it also springs from the deepest roots in ecology's history. So as early as the 3rd century, the Greek philosopher Theophrastus was conducting ecological experiments like transplanting plant species outside their natural range to see how they would grow. He also documented changes in phenology, so like deciduousness and evergreenness with climate, and then the relationship between altitude or latitude and climate and vegetation. In the 1800s, Alexander von Humboldt was an ecologist devoted to detailed measurement of the planet with the goal of understanding how physical and biological processes shape and sustain the world. And one of his publications included this schematic of a cross-section through the equatorial Andes. So here you can't really see it, but plant species are listed at the altitude at which you could find them. And so he could see changes in these distribution of species based on changing precipitation and temperature and other environmental variables with height. And then closer to home, at least for NCAR, these are Miriam life zones looking at zonation of vegetation within the San Francisco peaks. This is near Flagstaff, Arizona. So as you go up the mountain, you get more moisture, it's colder temperatures, and so different plant species can grow. Globally, we can think about this is called the Holdridge life zone system, which relates climate and vegetation zones using indices of temperature and moisture available for plants. So then, a long time ago, this was like a big thing to say like, oh, like climate impacts where vegetation can grow. And so I think at this point, now in ecology's history, we all agree climate impacts vegetation. Maybe when the climate change, vegetation might change, but the opposite is also true, like Will said. Vegetation impacts climate. So this is a map by Liu et al. Looking at the feedback of observed photosynthesis from satellites on temperature and precipitation. And so the map shows the fraction of the monthly variance in temperature or precip that's due to feedback from vegetation. So the darker colors indicate stronger feedback. So we can see a strong positive feedback with temperature in the boreal zone. And then the feedback for precip, which is on the bottom, is a little more patchy. And so, yeah, over short time scales, the vegetation feedback is dominated by albedo and evapotranspiration. Over longer time scales, it's really all about the fate of carbon. Okay, so this is a graph of atmospheric CO2 at the Mauna Loa Observatory. You've probably seen this graph a ton, but what do you notice about this graph? What's like the big thing that you notice? It's going up. Oh no. Okay, upward trend due to human activities. Okay, what's the other thing that you notice? Yes, the wiggles, the imprint. This is the imprint of land on the atmosphere. So it's basically the biosphere of breathing. So this is MODIS LAI, leaf area index, which is like greenness. So this is interannual variability in the land, which we can see in the atmosphere. So none of this matters, right? None of the atmospheric carbon stuff matters unless we have the land on top of it. So the vegetation is crucially involved in the uptake and storage of CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, so let's think about annual carbon emissions from fossil fuels. So before, this is looking at, and this is data from the Global Carbon Budget, which they publish one every year. But so this is looking at fossil fuel emissions in gray and land use change emissions in orange. So, and this is from energy statistics and cement production data, and then land use and land change data. So since about 1850, we've got 720 gigatons of carbon emissions. About a third of that total is from land use. Before 1920, it was mostly land use. Now it's mostly fossil fuel emissions. And then, so we can think about where is all these emissions going? So this dotted line is sort of the negative of the top red line, which is the total emissions. So a lot of it's going into the atmosphere, about 40%. Woo! That's what's getting us that 420 ppm about now. And this is measured directly. About a quarter of it is going into the oceans. That's measured through biogeochemistry models and some data products. Okay, where's the rest of it going? The land, right. Okay, so 30% of it is going into the land. This is the land sink. Okay, and this is based on global land vegetation models. Okay, so we also see this huge interannual variability, mostly driven by land carbon uptake, so uncertainty in land. And then we've got this budget imbalance. So the dashed red line is not actually, we're not totally filling it up. Sometimes we're over it, and that's also due to mostly uncertainty in land. So this land sink all depends on the global carbon cycle. So here's the global carbon cycle. So we've got these huge pools. So there's the land biota, soils and permafrost, a lot in permafrost. So 3 times as much carbon is in the soils and permafrost as in the land biota. We also noticed that, and here's some fluxes from emissions. So there's forest burning and human emissions. And then we also noticed there is a connection between the land and the ocean in terms of the carbon cycle, but it's very weak. And then what's left over after all of this, we've got these fluxes, right? These big fluxes, that's the land breathing. And what's the residual of all of these fluxes? We've got photosynthesis in, soil and plant respiration out. The residual of those fluxes is the land sink. Okay. So we want to model this carbon cycle. How do we do it? So this is the Bretherton diagram. So Francis Bretherton was the director of NCAR in the late 1970s. He was a huge leader in Earth system modeling. Before this, land modeling was kind of seen as fairly tangential to climate modeling. So adding terrestrial and marine biogeochemistry was one of his contributions to Earth system science. And so the focus here is on the interactions between the geosphere and the biosphere, with human forcings kind of represented as this outside force affecting the geosphere and biosphere system. So this launched the whole, it's called the Flying Leap proposal by Inez Fung, Peter Rayner, and Pierre Friedlingsting 25 years ago, which was an idea to have prognostic CO2 in the atmosphere from Earth system models like CESM. So instead of saying, this is how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, we actually want to model it using the carbon cycle. And so this matured into a figure like this, showing that the link between CO2 emissions and temperature change is critical and depends on the scenario, the emission scenario that you choose. That impacts how much warming you'll get. So crucially, we need to understand the carbon cycle in order to predict temperature change. So both NCAR and CESM were these key players in the development and concept, or the development of the concept and creation of the first coupled carbon cycle models. And since then, we've been improving the models. So, okay, pop quiz from Dwight Schrute. What's the most important element in the production of above ground leafy growth? Probably phosphorus, right? Wrong, it's nitrogen, okay? Absorb this information. Right, so we were the first, in CESM, we were the first Earth system model to include nitrogen in our carbon cycle predictions. That was used in CMIP5. And then we also, as Will said, were the first group to have explicit crop management in CESM too. So we're getting better and better at representing complexity in carbon cycle processes. So what can we do with a model like this? So we can do these cool idealized experiments where we do inject a prescribed amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So we can do something like 1% of CO2 per year. We can look at the land and ocean uptake as well as temperature change. And then this was so for CMIP 6, we did 3 experiments. So we can do fully coupled, where all the components are all coupled together. It's all feeding back on each other. We can just do biogeochemically coupled, meaning that the land and the ocean sees that there's increasing CO2, but it's not affected by increasing temperature, the temperature staying the same. Or we can look at radiatively coupled, meaning that the plants don't see any extra CO2, but we are seeing the temperature change. And so we can look at what happens to, let's see, like the land sink. Okay, so here's the cumulative CO2 land sink. So here's the fully coupled simulation. You can't really see CESM, but it's in dark green. It's behind the brown line. So it's increasing over time. What do you notice about this graph? And those are all different CMIP 6 models. What? It's in the, well, yeah, it's in the middle, so maybe that's good. But like what I notice is that there's large uncertainty in the magnitude of the land sink, okay? Yeah, if we look at the biogeochemically coupled simulation, still have pretty large uncertainty. It's also higher. Why do we think the land sink is higher when we're just seeing biogeochemically coupled? So no like temperature increases. Why is, so we think the land sink, here the models are predicting that the land sinks, so there's more carbon in the land, like the plants are increasing carbon over time in the biogeochemically coupled simulation compared to the fully coupled. Yeah, so like we're seeing the CO2 fertilization, right? The plants are really happy about having more CO2, but there's no, like we're not getting stressed out from heat maybe. Okay, and then here's the radiatively coupled simulation. We're very sad. Okay, and that's way less uncertainty. So I think a lot of our uncertainty comes from this, what happens when we have CO2 fertilization and the plants are like doing really well. When we're radiatively coupled, we're just having like heat stress maybe and drought. Okay, and then here's the cumulative ocean sink. Wow, they really got it down, right? they really understand. Okay, so I think what's going on here. So there's much less uncertainty in the ocean model, which is a lot at this scale. The global scale is much more dictated by physics instead of biology, which we have a better handle on. And so I think that's what's challenging about modeling the land, is that there's a lot of uncertainty and sort of like inherent randomness associated with biology, but it's also fun. Okay, so here's the temperature. So this is looking at global average surface temperature change. So the fully coupled simulation, the biogeochemical coupled one, which isn't changing, right? That makes sense. And then the radiatively coupled simulation. Okay, and what I notice here is that there's still all this spread in temperature due to airborne CO2 left in the atmosphere. And this is due to uncertainty in land biogeochemistry. So we really need to understand how the land is functioning, what the carbon is doing, how it's exchanging energy with the atmosphere in order to understand even just temperature change over time. Okay, so going back to the Brotherton diagram, we can map that onto a diagram showing the different components of CESM. So the land component is in green. And how do we model land biogeochemistry? With a lot of collaborators from the university. There's a lot of us here. So if you want to get involved, you definitely can. And yeah, maybe you can add your face here. Okay. So Will showed this. This is a diagram showing all the processes we're trying to represent in the land surface model. I'm just going to zoom in on the carbon cycle. So it's a lot of processes. You can get this book by Gordon Bonin, who's here, which shows sort of like a high level, but it also goes into a lot of detail about everything that we're trying to do. You can also check out our GitHub page, which has links to tech notes, and you can also check out issues. So yeah, we have the wealth of things that we're trying to do here, and lots of new features that we want to start adding, like fates, that we could use a lot of help with. Okay, so at a high level, what we're really trying to do is model the carbon cycle over time, which when we boil that down is just leaves, right? So we want to model photosynthesis and stomatal conductance, which right now we're doing leaf level photosynthesis is governed by the Farquhar photosynthesis model and the Medlin stomatal conductance model. Then we have photosynthesis at the leaf level, but then we have to scale that up to the whole canopy and calculate light transmittance, absorption, reflection through the canopy. We do that through what's called the two-stream radiation approximation, which we use a sunlit versus a shaded leaf. So this is important in the big leaf model. We call it the big leaf model, which you guys are using now in CLM 6, CLM 5, and CESM 3 is the default. We just represent it as like 2 big leaves per PFT. So it's a sunlit one and a shaded one. Okay, so that's a little bit simplified look at how forest canopies actually look like, but I'll get back to that. And so after we do that, we get GPP, which is gross primary productivity. Okay, so then we have to allocate that carbon to different tissues, like leaves, woods, and roots, and then respire. The plants also respire. So that gives us autotrophic respiration. And then combined, we can get net primary productivity, which is GPP minus AR. So after that, we need to worry about phenology. So like when our trees have leaves, when do they not have leaves, mortality, turnover, and litter. That all gives us leaf area index over time, which is really important for thinking about albedo and other surface energy exchanges. And then after we have leaf turnover and litter, we need to think about decomposition. So then we get heterotrophic respiration. So all of this happens in CLM. So we get all these nice acronyms: GPP, AR, NPP, LAI, and HR. And then out of that, we get NEP, net ecosystem production, which is just GPP minus AR minus HR. Net ecosystem exchange, which is that minus loss from fire. And that biome production, which is all that minus land use and harvest. Okay, but this is really tricky because, so we know GPP and AR goes into net primary production. That affects our leaf area, how much leaves the trees can produce. But the leaves that trees produce also affects GPP in respiration. And then leaf area affects the heterotrophic respiration by litter fall, which also affects GPP through nitrogen availability. Okay, so we've got all these feedbacks that make land modeling really complicated, but also fun. Okay, so Will already showed this as kind of how we tile up the land. I'm going to zoom in on this patch, here. Okay, so we've got the natural vegetated patch, and then we've got crops. Okay, so like Will said, the natural vegetation are all on their own, one single soil column. The crops are on individual soil columns so that we can have differences based on irrigation. And yeah, so plant species, like I said at the beginning, plant species respond differently to their environment. We can't have all plant species, all of them, right? There's like hundreds of thousands of them. So what we do is we group them based on traits, and so we call those plant functional types. So we have traits like deciduousness versus evergreen, tropical versus boreal versus temperate, shrubs versus trees. So all in all, we have 16 PFTs, and we have like 64 crop PFTs. And then on a tile, on a grid cell and then a tile, we have different proportions of that tile that we tell the model. We say there's like 30% is needleleaf evergreen, 20% is C3 grass, and then we've got some bare ground. So we're sort of telling the model like this is actually what proportion of the land surface is made up of each of these natural PFTs, and we do the same for crops. And then within that percentage, the trees, the plants grow or not grow. Okay, so we do have agriculture in CLM. So the most recent released version includes the option to use the crop model. Crops are simulated prognostically, so we simulate 11 crop types. We don't do tree crops right now. That would be cool. And then corn and soy have temperate and tropical varieties. We also have winter wheat and 2 biofuel crops. And there is an oil palm parameterization. It's never integrated. And then, yeah. On top of that, we include management like fertilizer and irrigation. And this is really important for the carbon cycle. Yeah. Okay, so we've got all these PFTs. Where do these parameter values come from? We have to decide how they interact differently with the environment. So some of it comes from laboratory understanding of plant physiological processes. So like the Farquhar photosynthesis model, it's co-limited by light, energy, and the export of sugars. Some of it can come from trait databases. So like the TRI database can get you maybe leaf nitrogen, dark respiration amount. Some of it comes from optimality theory. So we think plants are trying to optimize things like water use efficiency. So and then the FUN and Luna models can use that. Or sometimes these parameters are measurable or sort of figure outable, but sometimes they're not. They're just like tunable, and so we have to calibrate. And so we're focusing a lot on that. Will talked about the PPE, the perturbed parameter ensemble. So Linnea Hawkins is doing that with the CLM big leaf model. Here's looking at basically we run a big ensemble with a bunch of different parameter values, and then we try to constrain, minimize the difference from observations. So here's just looking at, we're minimizing difference from observations for LAI. So the gray one is like the first ensemble that we ran, and then we have these different waves. We're getting closer and closer to observations as we constrain our parameter values. And then over here, I'm doing it with fates. So it's a similar thing. Okay. So now let's think about future direction. So, okay, so one big good thing in CESM2, so this is the CESM1, this is the cumulative land sink over time from 1960 to 2010. And CSM2 is in red, 1 is in red, CSM2 is in blue and green, and then the black is observation. So CSM1, we were not representing a land sink. It was negative, so it's not good. Now we're actually representing the land sink, so that's good. CSM2 got better, and we're consistently getting better. So this is, if you've never heard of ILAM, this is the International Land Model Benchmarking Package. So this is just a way of, it's a collection of data sets and then a Python package to evaluate model output against a bunch of different observations. And so we're looking at different CESM runs for a bunch of different output variables. So there's like carbon, GPP, different hydrology variables, radiation, and so red means it's worse, green is better. So if we go forward in time, we're getting better. So we're objectively getting better, except for soil carbon. But I'm told that that's not our fault. It's the atmosphere's fault. But don't come at me. Okay, it snowed too much in the Arctic. It's not my fault. Okay. Okay, so as I said, we're sort of like, we're definitely getting better, but we're also getting more complex over time. So in the beginning, in the 70s, sort of land was seen as just like a lower boundary condition of the atmosphere. We just want it to be green, sometimes not green, other times, right? But then we added plant canopies, maybe some stomatal resistance, soil moisture. Dynamic vegetation came in the early 2000s. Now we're interested in nutrients, crops, lateral flow of moisture. So we're getting much more complex, and now we see land, or at least I see land, as an integral component of the Earth system. Okay, so we want to ask, how do ecosystems change when climate changes? Really, we should change just how will ecosystems change with climate change, right? And so, as I said, plants are these integral components in the Earth system. They affect the climate. And forest height, structure, age, and competition are all key components of this feedback. And so, as I said, in CLM, Big Leaf, we model photosynthesis, stomatal conductance, shade and sun leaves, and these boundary layer differences, as well as plant canopies. But we don't model this sort of like dynamic structure of the vegetation, which we think is really important. So yeah, so in CLM, we're doing a really good job at this part, maybe not so good at this part of how trees interact with their environment. So we know that forests are this mosaic of patches. So we can if we look out at a forest canopy, we can see there's this gap here. There's a dying tree. There's some young trees. And then over time, forest dynamics are the average responses of of many such gaps or patches. Okay, so FATES, the functionally assembled ecosystem simulator, is trying to model this. So it's a cohort-specific model, meaning that we're modeling individual trees, although those they're cohorts that are representative of some number of trees. So it's not individual trees, it's cohorts of trees. We're still, importantly, modeling this 30-minute or however many, but it's canonically 30-minute photosynthesis and other fluxes over time. But then we have daily growth and allocation, and thus we get dynamic vegetation. And so it's different. The tiling is different. So this is the CLM Big Leaf. We're tiling by PFT. The PFTs don't interact at all. They just say, like, here they are, grow some stuff. In FATES, we're tiling by age-sense disturbance. So each of these patches has a specific age since the last time a disturbance happened. And a disturbance can be a tree fall, fire, harvest, anything else that's in the model. And then on each of these patches, we have different cohorts of plants that are discretized by different PFTs and size. Okay, so this is really important. It's a really cool thing that we're doing. It's now the future. We've decided that in CLM, we are adopting FATES. So in the future, this is going to be the default vegetation model in CLM. Okay, so we also do cool things under the ground. So mimics, we're modeling microbial controls on soil carbon. So mimics is a soil carbon model that considers relationships among litter quality, functional trade-offs in microbial physiology and microbial byproducts. And so we think this more accurately represents carbon response to nitrogen enrichment, which is really important if we want to think about how plants might adapt to like CO2 fertilization. And then I'm just going to skip over this because we'll talk about the representative hill slope model, but that's also a cool future thing that we're doing. So to answer this big question, how will ecosystem change with climate change? We are hoping to use CTSM, the land model that can be used for climate change and weather predictions, can be run at single points up to the global scale. This hill slope hydrology model, which considers the effective aspect and elevation. FATES, which we're dynamically representing vegetation, demographics, traits, recovery from disturbances, and then mimics, which gets us this better soil biogeochemistry model. And yeah, now I'll take any questions you guys have.
I had a question. As an oceanographer, I feel like I think about the atmosphere and the ocean, as a fluid, and when I think of the land, it's extremely different, and when I think about these subgrid scale features that we do in even sea ice or ocean atmosphere, you can do a lot of, playing around with parameterizations and stuff. And things don't change too much. I saw in the CSM Lens 1 kind of time series that you showed before,
Yeah.
there was almost like a opposite sign of the response. Is it the case that we're limited by just the understanding of what's happening inside the grid cell, or just the resolution itself is a limiting factor in how we model?
For the land?
Yeah.
I don't, I think, yeah, I guess I agree with Will. I don't think that getting just more grid cells is gonna help resolve this uncertainty. I think it's the process uncertainty that we need to resolve. And, when people think about high resolution, we have to think about high spatial resolution, but you could also think about high resolution in terms of plant functional types. So you could say like, well, maybe we need more than 16 PFTs, right? Or high resolution in terms of vegetation leaves, right? Where in terms of a big leaf canopy versus fates, which is like getting you dynamic vegetation at different heights. And so I think like that in terms of that, I do think we need higher resolution, but not in maybe the traditional way we talk about high resolution in terms of spatial grid, but in terms of the processes that we're representing and how we're grouping vegetation and thinking about vegetation.
And that's what was happening here with the lens.
No, this is all big leaf, so I think we just got better. I don't know, actually, I don't know what the fundamental difference between CESM 1 and 2 is, but, well, maybe it's nitrogen, we did add a nitrogen cycle, so it could have been that, but, yeah.
Still have a question?
Yeah, thanks. I was thinking about the bias in CSM for the vegetation phenology. And the earlier spring we have. I was thinking how fates or CLM modeling the vegetation. Is it like the vegetation phenology? Is it climatology? And if we're gonna have, for instance, one drought this year, they're gonna be late phenology like next year. So can see like fakes such.
Yeah, so I
dynamics?
think in CLM, I'm not sure we would have that because I think it's just based on like a moving average of, and it's like a pretty small window. And these like sort of like, the phenology is very like, it's very highly parameterized. But in fates, you could, I think in big leaf or fates, you could have this kind of like memory of like what happened last year, which we know in real life that does, like the last year's climate affects this year's phenology because it depends on how much carbon you have to put off and like what you decide as a plant to do. And so that is something you can definitely do in fates, even more so.
I have a question regarding this diagram. So
Okay.
this is like the global
Yes.
carbon sink. And
Yes.
do you see regional differences?
Oh,
How
yeah,
the
yeah.
Where the model performs better or worse, in which regions or?
Yeah, I'm not sure here, but yes, like we perform better in some regions of the world. Like whereas like the total carbon, we think it's a land sink, but like there are areas of the globe that are not. So like specifically, I think there was a paper that came out a while ago looking at just Alaska across all these different models, and like the models diverged whether it was a sink or a source. And I think this was like this was recent, so they were using CLM 4 or 5 probably. And so yeah, there's different areas of the globe. If you look even further, it's like more uncertain. Is it a source? Is it a sink? And a lot of that is due to like maybe the representation of disturbances and plant functional types.
So I have two questions. The first one is like you're incorporating the nitrogen cycle kind of, or is it like more the ratios, C to N?
Yeah, so the tissues have carbon to nitrogen ratios, and in CLM, so I'm not totally familiar with how this works, but the way that the GPP is dependent on how much nitrogen you have available to you, and so then that nitrogen becomes available through decomposition. Yeah.
And then like so there are also phosphorus limited regions?
I don't think we don't have, no, we don't have.
Okay. And then I have one clarification question. I didn't really get it completely in the, so when you were talking about the PFTs and the crops.
Yeah.
They all have their own column? Like
The
kind of,
natural, yeah.
so there's like no competition for nutrients and water? Or there is?
No, there is. So, sorry, for crops?
No, for like the
The natural
natu-
PFTs?
Well, I guess both. Or is it different for both?
Sorry, okay, whatever. The natural PFTs are all in one, they share a soil column.
Okay.
So there is definitely competition. And then, but the crop PFTs are all on their own soil columns. I don't actually know about how that would work. You have to ask a crop person, but I guess theoretically, no. There isn't competition between the crops.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
This one?
Hi, I have a question in the model benchmark. I think it's in the slide 48. So here's the relation between burned area versus precipitation is really good comparing to the other ones. Do you have any idea on, is it physics or something else that has?
Yeah. The relationship between burned area is
Versus precipitation?
Yeah. I'm sure, so I think we, like Will said, the fire model in CESM2 is like very, very highly tuned. So there's like lots of parameters and they're all sort of like tuned really, really finely to the burned area product. So that's probably why. So there's not, so that's in the CLM, sort of like the current default version of CLM. In Fates, as Will was alluding to, we have this model called Spitfire, which is much more process-based. So there's a lot less tunable parameters, and so I would expect that the relationship would not be as good. That would be nice. But I think importantly, like burned area isn't the only, that's an important component of fire, how fire affects the landscape, but it's not the only thing. Like there's how much burns, same burned area, you could have different soil. We don't even burn soil in CLM, but soil depth burn, different amounts of vegetation burn, and so that is an important component that I'd like to start also validating again.
I guess this is kind of a good follow-up too, because I was going to ask a question about the fire. So on the next slide.
This one?
Sorry, one more maybe, where it says like the percentage of sense disturbances.
This one?
The disturbances percentage for the grid cells. Like the.
Oh.
Yeah,
this one. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering if he talked about the fire model not being able to sort of predict sort of area of fires burned, but I'm wondering if something like this could be helpful for predicting, for example, if it hasn't been disturbed in, for example, 90 years.
Yeah.
Does that have more of a chance to be a bigger wildfire?
Yes. And we do see this in Fates. So in Fates, because Spitfire is using, the Lee fire models is what we use in the default CLM. It does have fuel, but in Fates we have dynamic fuel. So as more trees are growing, this 90-year-old stand, there's going to be theoretically bigger trees that drop more litter, and the litter has been sitting there, maybe decomposing, but in some areas decomposition is really slow, like in the boreal North America. And so if we do get a fire, it's going to be way more intense because there's more fuel to burn. Exactly. Versus a 1-year-old patch, which probably has nothing to burn. Right?
Okay. So you can sort of couple those things and then predict fire.
Yeah, that's kind of what Spitfire does. Exactly. Yeah.
I know the face is able to represent more processes, but I'm wondering currently does it perform better than Big Leap model in terms of some basic variables such as
no. So it's so I think there's a lot of reasons why that is, but first of all it's more complex, and so there's just way more processes so I showed that sort of snake diagram where everything was interacting. There's even more with Fates because now we have trees that are actively competing with one another for resources and light, and then we've got forest succession involved, and there's just not as many people CLM sort of was a lot of work was done on it years ago to get it to this really nice state now, and Fates has kind of historically had fewer people working on it. So right now, at NCAR at least, it's just me. So, we want, this is why we sort of decided we can't support people developing the big leaf model anymore. So people external to us, and then within, because we need to focus all of our efforts on improving fates. But that is what I am currently doing right now, is calibrating and improving fates in satellite phenology mode. So like Will says, just biophysics, and then the next move would be, which in collaboration with other fates, people outside of NCAR, so fates can be run in these different complexity modes. So like CLM, you can run it with just forced with satellite phenology, so forced LAI and vegetation height. You can then say, okay, now I do want you to run vegetation demographics and forest succession over time, but each of the PFTs are sort of like on their own patch, so they're not competing with each other, so we don't have this problem of like one PFT just like completely dominates, and then we kind of like, it's really hard to get that right, so that's called no competition mode. And then after that, we have this, it's called fixed biogeography mode, where we are letting the PFTs compete, but we're saying like on this grid cell or at this site, there's only 3 PFTs here. So just you guys grow and compete, but nobody else is allowed. And then there's like full fates, which is we just say, here's like 16 PFTs, grow where you grow, which I feel like, personally, I feel like that is maybe a little problematic, because we know that the distribution of plant species is not only dependent on climate and like how plants interact, but also like along millions of years of land use history. So I think there's maybe like things you could said about saying maybe we do tell plants sometimes where to grow, but I don't know. Yeah, that's an active area of research. So.
One question about, like, you mentioned that like older trees leave more or like they shed more leaves.
Yeah.
Is there also like an active human part, like where there's like forest fire management, so like this kind of clearing of the fossils?
Yeah, we've got people who are adding in. So Charlie Coven, who's the lead PI for fates at the Department of Energy, he added in this land cover change module for fates, and then we just had a collaborator add. I think it's about to be added to the main branch of the GitHub repo of fates, like fire management. So, and then there's wood harvest too. So yes, like all of that, you can add all of that stuff to fates. Yeah.
Very small question.
Yeah.
What is the computational burden for fates compared to? Is it like much?
It's higher. Yeah, it's higher. Yeah. I mean, there's more PFTs. So we're not not more PFTs. There's more. So in CLM, big leaf, we're modeling like 2 canopies per PFT, right? In fates, we're modeling many, potentially hundreds of cohorts per PFT per patch. And so there's more to do, which I think is okay. We're giving all this data, we're giving all this runtime to the atmosphere. The land matters too.
I agree.
Hi, I think earlier you mentioned that maybe a dry year can influence the next year.
I think that was him, yeah, but yes.
I'm very curious about that. Why how can it be reflected in the model or?
Yeah, well, so in fates at least. So if you have a dry year, if you're not really good at, maybe you're a plant that closes your stomata early when you experience stress, and so you don't have as much carbon, and then so you don't make as much leaves, you don't put out as much leaves, and then the next year, you just have less carbon to spend to allocate to your tissues, and then if you have less leaf tissue, you make less carbon, and so you can get into, and then if we add things like insect disturbance, if you're already stressed out, you can get into this like death spiral that we see in real life. That trees that are stressed from, say, like a drought, the next year might get hit by insects, and so then we get into this like sort of death spiral. And so we could, you could do that in fates.
It's related to some carbon cycle, but how about soil moisture?
Yeah, or soil moisture, right? Exactly. So if you have less soil moisture, then you would be more moisture stressed potentially.
Yeah. I'm curious, like, so you'd mentioned both that you think there's more work to do in increasing maybe this like land resolution in terms of PFTs, all this, and obviously there's been a lot of work done on the incorporating tree height variability or this like land disturbance time.
Yeah.
Are there particular areas that you have found that have made a massive difference in terms of like incorporating particular, I don't know, nuances to this, and then areas that you are focused on, I don't know, increasing that resolution?
Yeah, I mean, so I think increasing the connection between the above and below ground is really important, especially when thinking about disturbances. So I work with forest models where, you know, when you have, in the at least specifically in the boreal zone, where, you know, we have fires that impact below ground, the below ground burning, and then what burns impacts, how much burns impacts what trees regrow, and you can get into these like bistability regions where, you know, we can't model it correctly unless we connect everything all together. And so I think things like that are really important. So understanding how plants sort of interact with their environment, you know, maybe the soil, how decomposition happens over time, and how the fuel that's there impacts things like fire, and then how that leads to post-fire regrowth.
Is that being worked on right now, or is that like something that you're working on for the future?
I am doing that right now in one of my projects. I'm doing some of that in Northwest Territories with Fates, but then more broadly here in my sort of like NCAR non-grant funded role, I'm just doing like global calibration. So what we're trying to do is get Fates to a point where like you can run it out of the box and it gives you like really nice, good values that other, you know, like external people can come in and start playing around with it and figuring out new areas for development or improvement. Yeah.
Okay, it's time. Let's thank Adrianna again. So in the next 15 minutes, we'll be talking about an introduction of simple XML modifications, which is the lab session we're going to do today. So yeah, so this is the outline. We will go through what are the model control files, or this file starts with env and ends with XML extensions. We'll talk about what they are and how to modify them. And we're going to talk about how to control the length of our run using these model control files. And we will also briefly touch on how to modify the type of run, and then go over the exercise overview for today's lab. So yesterday, we've learned the basics of running CSM. We know that to run a CSM simulation, you have 4 basic steps. You have create a new case, and then you have case setup, case submit, case build, and then case submit. So after invoking the create new case, if you take a look at your case directory, you will find there is a series of new files created. And then some of these files look like this. They start with this env underscore and then something else, followed by the XML extensions, and these are the model control files. So we use these model control files to control how we want to run and compile our model simulation. And again, these files are created after you invoke create new case. And the most commonly used model control file is the env_run.xml. We use this file to control the run length, run type, etc., based on our experiment design. And this is the main file we will be practicing in today's lab. And there are other different XML files, and if you have time, I encourage you to take a look at them. Just open them up with your favorite text editor. You will see there are different variables in these files, and under each of these, you will have a brief description of what these variables are. So this will come in handy if you are going back to your institute and trying to do some more advanced modifications, and you will know what they are. Yeah, so env_run will be the one we'll be talking about. For first of all, how to modify and edit these files. So we highly recommend that you use this XML change tool. Some of you have already practiced this yesterday, but you are also welcome to use your own text editors, for example, VI or Emacs. But the reason why we highly recommend XML change is that every time you use this tool, it will be automatically documented in your case status document. So when you go back to look at this document, you know exactly what kind of changes you already made to your case. And this is extremely important. I can't stress this enough because if you set up, especially complicated run, you want to change a whole bunch of stuff, and you think you remember everything you did, but in 2 or 3 months, you will forget it. I promise you, you will forget it, okay? So it's very important to document whatever you do to your case. And to use XML change is very easy. You just use this syntax. You have ./XML change followed by the variable name you want to change and equals to the value you want to change it to. So in this example, we changed this variable name called continue run. We changed the value from false to true. Yeah, we practiced this yesterday. Hopefully, it's straightforward. And another tool is called XML query. This one is used to search a certain XML variable. For example, if you want to know the value of this variable called run type, you would just type ./XML query followed by the variable name, and this will return the value of this variable. So at any time you want to learn more about these tools, or if you forgot how to use them, you can just type this command and -- help. This will give you a main page of everything you will ever need with this tool. Yeah, question?
Is there an easy way
List. So
or do you know, like, first use a text editor to
yeah,
open it and then upwards?
that's a good question. There are 2 ways of doing it. The first way is to open up with the text editor, and you can see what variables are. The other way is that you can use a -p. So for example, if you use like XML query -p means partial, and you type in wall clock, a keyword of a certain variable you think that's called. For example, you forgot what wall clock time variable is named. You remember wall something. So your XML query -p wall will give you all the possible variables that starts with the wall. Yeah, question?
Thing. We're not specifying what file we're changing, so is it looking at all of the XML files and then figuring out where to make that edit?
Yeah, it will search all of the XML files, no matter where it is. Yeah. Yeah.
As for the follow-up question for the XML change, is it able to specify which group to change?
Yeah.
For example, like some variable that might exist in more than one group.
Right. There is a function called subgroup. So it's like XML change -- subgroup, and then you can specify the specific subgroup you're trying to change. And this information you can all find in the tutorial lab material. So I'm just giving an overview, everything you will find in there. Yeah, these are very good questions. Okay. More? Okay.
Very quickly, can you remind me what's the difference, hybrid and branch?
Oh, yeah. Well, this is in the document.
Okay, I can find it. Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. Do you have a
Can you change the concept using XML change?
concept?
Yes, can you change it there?
No, because concept you can only change it at the time you create your case. Yes, that's the only time. Okay. Carry on. Okay, we're gonna learn how to control the length of a run with env_run.xml. And controlled by several runtime variables, and these variables can be modified at the time of initialization of the model run or during the course of the model run. So you don't have to change this variable and build the model again, right? We will learn how to customize your runtime settings to control how to start, stop, restart, and continue a model run, and practice how to specify the length of your long simulations. So the first 2 variables I want to introduce are stop option and stop n. The run length options can be set with these 2 variables in the env_run.xml. Stop option sets the run length time interval type. For example, it could be n months, n days, n years, etc. And the stop n sets the number of interviews. For example, just if you want to do like 6 months of simulation, you can set the stop option as n months and stop option as n months and stop n as 6, right? But one thing to note is that stop option and stop n control the length of the run for each job submission. Okay, so if you imagine you want to run a very long simulation of 100 years, But because we can only sit in the HPC job queue for a limited time, in the case of derecho, it's 12 hours, you couldn't really finish this 100-year simulation in one job submission, right? So you have to divide this long run into smaller pieces and submit one job one at a time. But the stop option and stop end, just know that this controls each job submission. And then another important concept is continue run. So in the example there, we want to submit a long simulation and it is divided into smaller pieces. At each job submission, it can either be an initial run, which means that it starts from the very beginning of the simulation, or it should be a continue run, means that you want this job submission to continue from a previously completed job submission, right? And we tell the model if the current job submission is an initial run or a continue run with this variable flag is called literally continue run. If at the time of submission, your continue run variable is set to be false, this tells the model that this current job submission is the initial run. And if it's set to true, then the model knows this is a continue run. I want to continue from whatever is left off. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that we submit our initial job with continue run variable set to be false, because it's just getting started. And if the run has been finished and everything looks good, and now you want to continue the run for another month, what do you do, right? So in this case, you will have to change the continue run variable to be true, so that model knows that the model wants to run this 1 month again from where it was finished, so that at the end you have 2 job submissions and you have 2 months long simulation. So if at this time when you finish your first simulation, and if you don't set don't set this variable to be true, it's still to be false, then the model thinks again this is an initial run. So you want to run from the very beginning. So at the end it will run the first month all over again. So after these 2 job submissions, you only get the first month, but twice, right? And then the next very important variable is called resubmit. Recall that we talked about stop end and stop option only control the length of each job submission. And a long model run consists a number of job submissions. And then we can specify the number of times to resubmit your run using this resubmit variable. So the total number of submissions would be your first submission plus the number you specified in this resubmit variable. And there's an interesting relationship between this resubmit variable and continue run. So if this resubmit variable is set to be a number bigger than 0, then the model recognizes that you want this to be a long simulation, and it will automatically change the continue run value to be true after the completion of your first initial run. Question?
And like this, you don't have to readjust the starting time for, you
Yes.
can just change that?
Yeah, you just change continue run, and the model will pick up where it was left off. So basically what happens is that after your each simulation, it will output restart files. Some of you may have already seen that in your archive directory, right? Those restart files contains information of where the current model is, and if you want to continue from this, what you will need. So the model, if you set the continue run to be true, the model will look for those restart files and try to start from there. Yeah, question?
So if you're running this longer simulation and this 12-hour queue time or wall clock limit is reached, how does the model stop
Yeah.
at the end of a certain integration, or does it sometimes get cut off in the middle?
It just get killed.
Okay, so it uses the previous restart file from.
Yeah, so the model didn't, if it get killed, it didn't have time to output the new restart file.
Use the previous time steps.
Right, it will have to use the previous time step. Yeah, so it's very important to set a reasonable wall clock limit time so your job doesn't get terminated. Yeah. All right, question?
How do you sort of estimate how long a run would take? And I mean, I guess if the resubmit value is greater than 0, probably doesn't matter, but
Well, it will have a timing file. you will find all this information in the learning material again. But after you finish the model simulation, it will give you a timing file. It contains information, approximately how many years per hour your model can output.
Okay.
Something like that. Okay. Oh yes, I have a quiz. Perfect timing. So our tutorial version of the CSM model under Rachel, let's say it simulates 10 model years per wall clock day. And the maximum wall clock request is 12 hours. So each job submission you can request at most 12 hours. Now that you want to run a model run for 100 years, what values should you be set for stop option, stop end, and resubmit? Right? I'll ask one of you to answer it in 2 seconds. All right, just kidding. Let's go through this all together. Now, assume we want to use the full 12 hour for each job submission. And we know that the model runs 10 years per 24 hours, which means that for a 12-hour job submission, we can run 5 years, right? And then in this case, we can set the stop option to be n years, stop end to be 5. So each job submission, we run 5 years. And the number of resubmit should be set to 19 because we would have an initial round of 5 years, plus the 19 resubmissions, and each is also 5 years. Together will give us 100 years, right? Yeah?
Really, right? If it takes, for example, if it's 9.5 model years per wall clock day, and what happens then? You don't have intermediate restart files, so then for 19 resubmissions, it just kind of crashes 19 times.
No, because you can specify different options with stop end, right? You don't have to, every time you don't have to submit 12-hour job. Well, maybe we can discuss this more.
No, it's fine.
If I think the maximum is 12 hours, but if we don't need it, we can put less hours. Yeah.
Right.
And I think maybe that would be
12
optimal.
hours, you can simulate 9.5 years. You don't have to set your stop end and stop option to be 9.5 years. You can set it to be 9 years. You can complete 9 years in 12 hours, right?
So would you recommend using 12 hours, the max, or
Well, it depends
if you
on your job timing.
or reducing the resubmit time? Which would you recommend?
Well, it depends on the case.
Okay.
Right. Well, yeah, you'll find this information in the learning material. I'm running out of time. Okay. Okay. So that was just the quiz to help you understand what's going on. But then there's also 3 types of runs. You have startup, hybrid, and branch. Again, you will find this in your learning material. You can understand what they are. But I want to stress that this run type setting is only relevant for the initial round of a production run. So you really need to set this before your initial submission. So after initial submission, when you set your continue run to be true, then if you change the run type, it will be no longer relevant. Okay. More details is in the learning material. But there's this overview of today's exercises. So for exercise 1, you will practice a runtime variable modification, that's a simple one. For exercise 2, you will create a branch run, one of the run types, and modify the ocean coupling frequency, which is another variable you can specify in the run.xml file. And in exercise 3, you will create a hybrid run, again, a different run type, and you can try to modify the atmosphere physics time step, which is another variable you can find in the run.xml. So yeah, that's the overview of the exercise. You will find, I promise you will find all the details in the learning material, okay? Okay, so that's it. And I want to say that, again, you are welcome to use the Damon room for exercise if you want. It's quieter and more beautiful. But if you have questions, you may have to come back to the library. And then for me, the scientist, please go to lunch at about 11:45 so that you can get lunch before the long line. And Elizabeth will be at the library. If you want to know where your Meet a Scientist location is, you can ask her. She will take you there. Okay?
So I think they can hear me up in the booth, so I'm online too. So hi, everyone. I'm Alice. I also want to point out Dave Bailey, who is the Polar Climate Working Group liaison. He's hanging out over here, and you'll see him. So if you have other sea ice questions this week and I'm not around, he might be around instead. All right, so I'm here to talk to you about how we do the sea ice modeling in CESM. And what I'm presenting today is not just slides I made, or my work, it's contributions from lots of people. All right, so I know that everyone who attends this tutorial is not necessarily interested in sea ice, or they might not even really know what sea ice is. And so this first slide, just what is sea ice? And you might just, I'm trying to make sure we're all on the same page here. So sea ice is frozen seawater, so ocean water. It usually forms seasonally. Because it's frozen ocean water, that means there's a little bit of salt in it, and that's how, that's actually really important for how it behaves. It's not the same as land ice like you get in a glacier or an ice sheet. So these are all pictures of sea ice that you might see if you were flying over it. And one of the big points that I think all those show and that these show is that sea ice is really, really heterogeneous. So there's a lot of sub-grid scale variability at the grid scales that we use in CESM, and almost any grid scale you would use in a climate model. So what you see in these pictures here are that you can have ridges. So this is where ice comes together and it builds up. So that's a ridge like we see here. You can also have ice that diverges, pulls apart, and that can cause a lead like you see here. These can be on the order of 10 meters to 500 meters or even larger sometimes. You can also see from this picture on the surface that you can have melt ponds that form from melting snow on top of the sea ice, and they're different colors. And then the edge of this ice flow is right here, and you can see these darker bits are actually open water that have ice flows in them. And so there's a lot of variability in what sea ice can look like, its size, the albedo, all of that. All of these individual flows create a continuous cover in most of the Arctic or the Antarctic, but the concentrations can vary. And the thickness of sea ice is on the order of meters. So some of the deepest, thickest ridges you'll get would be maybe like 10 to 20 meters. It's not nearly as thick as land ice. So, it's not, in most places, it's not going to be anywhere near the bottom of the ocean. In some very shallow areas, you could have sea ice actually reach the bottom of the ocean and get grounded, but I'm not going to talk about that much today. So this is an animation of sea ice in CESM, and you have the Arctic on the left and the Antarctic on the right. You can just see how the sea ice changes throughout the year. And one of the things I want to point out is that sea ice is also complicated because it moves around. So not only do you have all that subgrid scale variability and heterogeneity, the ice changes throughout the seasonal cycle and it moves around. So you have to keep track of it as it moves throughout the different grid cells, unlike, say, land that doesn't move. So I just think this is a really beautiful animation, but it brings us to another thing. I'm just trying to get us all on the same page about the Arctic versus Antarctic sea ice. So sea ice in the Arctic Ocean, as you can see here, is an ocean that's bounded primarily by land. And that means that when ice hits the coast of one of these land areas, it can build up and converge, and you can get really thick ice in the Arctic. The land boundaries and then the ocean heat content, primarily here in the North Atlantic sector, determine how far ice can extend in winter months. So we have the September ice extent, which is the minimum here. In general, the September ice extent is around 5 million square kilometers, and then it grows throughout the whole fall and into the spring, and it reaches its maximum in March, so that's what this can look like here. And the extent then is about 12 million square kilometers. So you get this change of about 7 million square kilometers throughout the annual cycle. The other thing I want to point out that many of you probably know, two things, I guess, to take away from this if you think of nothing else about sea ice. First, in the Arctic, you have polar bears. You don't have any penguins here, you just have polar bears. And that this September sea ice signal is one that we often use as one of the most obvious signals of climate change. So we've seen this very clear decrease in sea ice extent in at the end of summer in the Arctic. And this has to do with the ice getting thinner and going away. So the Antarctic is our other pole that has sea ice, so the other area we have to worry about. In contrast to the Arctic, it is unbounded, so it's a continent that's surrounded by ocean, and this means that the ice can extend as far north as it wants until it reaches ocean temperatures that are warm enough it'll melt the ice. So the ice is often in what we call free drift. I'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about dynamics, but it's not running into the continent edges and building up as much. And the sea ice in the Southern Ocean is much more seasonal, and it has always been seasonal. So in the Antarctic summer, which you reach your minimum in about March, and it has an extent, the sea ice has an extent of 3 million square kilometers. And then it grows all the way up to about 17 million square kilometers, reaching its maximum in September. So of course the opposite of the northern hemisphere. And this change is about 14 million square kilometers, so twice as much as the Arctic in terms of extent. So this huge seasonal cycle that we have to resolve. And then the ice melts back all the way almost to the edges of the continent everywhere in the summer. Again, big takeaway, there are penguins here. There are no polar bears. If there were polar bears, they would eat those penguins as fast as they could. But the other thing I want you to just know is that over the observational record, the trends in the Antarctic have been much less pronounced and somewhat contradictory. So from the start of the satellite record until about the mid-2000s, like 2007, there was pretty much no trend in sea ice extent. And then we started to get an increase in sea ice extent all the way up until about 2015. And then there was this huge decrease in sea ice extent. And now it's been pretty low again. And we've actually reached the record minima that satellites have observed in 2023. So it's kind of had these contradictory trends. There's a lot of discussion in the literature, in the research community about why this is. And so this is just something, I guess, if you're going to be looking at sea ice, I want you to be aware of, especially if you're looking at the model, because I don't think any model that I am aware of that's especially a free-running model can get these trends correctly. So if you see it in CESM and you're like, oh, that trend is wrong, all of the models are wrong in the Antarctic with the trends. The other thing to point out that's relevant for sea ice modeling is that in the Arctic and Antarctic, you can have very different processes that are the primary driving processes of how the sea ice evolves. So we have the Arctic here on the top with our polar bears. And one thing that's important as you go from left to right here, we're looking at spring into summer in either hemisphere, is that in the Arctic, you get a lot of melt that starts from the top. So the sun comes up, it starts melting the snow, and you form melt ponds, and the melt ponds affect the albedo, affect the feedbacks you get. And so this is really important for the melt part of the seasonal cycle. In the Antarctic, in contrast, pretty much all of the melt in their summer is from below, so you're not getting melt ponds the same way, but you also form ice differently. In the Antarctic, you get a lot more snow ice formation, so you get a lot more snow deposited on the sea ice. It pushes it down below the level of the ocean. That snow then freezes, and you get this snow ice forming that turns into sea ice as well. And again, if you're like, sea ice, I don't really care about this, I'm here for CAM, you should at least care that it's in the Earth system model. So way back, some of the first models, sea ice was specified, and what they found was that it didn't really create climates that were realistic. And that's because sea ice really impacts the surface energy budget. So the albedo of sea ice is really, really high. We're looking here at the albedo, so it's like above 0.8 compared to open ocean of 0.1. And so the surface energy budget, with respect to the radiation terms, the sea ice really impacts this. And then it also impacts turbulent fluxes by kind of isolating the ocean from the atmosphere. And so you can't just get a moisture flux directly through or heat fluxes directly through. The ice kind of mediates that. It's also really important for the hydrologic cycle and ocean circulation. So when ice forms, there's a little bit of salt in it, but most of the salt gets rejected from the sea ice. It goes down into the ocean. You get saltier water. It affects the water masses, how they move around. So it can affect all these currents that you're seeing here in the global ocean circulation. But the ice itself also moves, and it can then be a source of fresh water. So if it forms in the central Arctic and then it gets pushed out through Fram Strait and then it melts somewhere else, then you're basically getting a source of fresh water there. And then the last thing I wanted to point out is that it's really important for a number of climate feedbacks. I just have a couple examples here. This is not exhaustive. But it's really important for the albedo feedback. There are ice growth thickness feedbacks, and then there are ice cloud feedbacks as well. So you can't just entirely ignore it. So what do we need for a sea ice model in something like CESM? So the first thing is that we want a model that creates reasonable mean state and variability. This means the concentration, thickness, mass budgets of the sea ice, and it has to do that in both hemispheres. We want it to have realistic exchanges of heat and moisture between the ice, ocean, and atmosphere. You want it to respond reasonably to climate perturbation. So if we double CO2, we want the sea ice to go away in a way that seems sensible. And then it also needs to be computationally efficient. So we run these models for thousands of years. We run ensembles, all of that. It can't be super, super expensive. We talked about this a little at my lunch group today, that the cost of models, sea ice models compared to other parts of the model. So the sea ice model that we use within CESM is CEIS. It's also known as the CEIS consortium model. It used to be developed at Los Alamos. Now this international consortium worked together to develop it. So NCAR is one of the partners that does that. All of the documentation and code is online at these different websites if you wanted to look at them. And I wanted to point out too, so CEIS is kind of the full model of thermodynamics and dynamics, so 1D and 2D parts of the model. Some people have mentioned they've used IcePack. That's just the 1D thermodynamic column physics, and that's also developed by the CEIS consortium. And you can get all that information online. Relevant for any of you in this room, if you're using CESM 2, we use CEIS version 5.1.2 if you needed to get documentation for that. And CESM 3 is using CEIS version 6. The big difference in this is more of like a code infrastructure thing of the IcePack being separated out from everything else. So unless you're really into code development, you probably don't have to worry about that. All right, so what does CEIS and other sea ice models have that are really important within CESM? So this robot, imagine that's the sea ice model, and we're kind of putting it together. So we have 3 primary components that we need in CEIS, and these have been here for a little while. So we have a dynamic component, a thermodynamic component, and then an ice thickness distribution. So the dynamics here. This is the ice moving around. What we do within the dynamic part of CEIS is we solve a force balance to determine how the ice moves around and how it might deform as it runs into coasts or other bits of ice, or you get leads, that sort of thing. And then we have a rheology, which is basically a way to describe how stress and deformation or the flow of the ice behaves. So here's the equation for looking at the dynamic part of the sea ice model. This is obviously a long, the equation's from 1979, so it's been around a long time. It's not anything new and fancy. The 2 terms I want to highlight that maybe other people have thought about more is the air stress or the ocean ice stress terms within this. So we have the Coriolis force as well, and sea surface slope, how the slope of the ocean might affect movement of the ice flows or convergence, stuff like that. And then ice stress within the internal stress within the ice itself. But the air stress and the ocean stress are ones that honestly I think about most. You can see that these are drag equations. It's a simple quadratic. You have, the ice stress depends on the square of wind speed or the roughness, the density of air, stuff like that. The ocean stress is similar. It depends on the difference between the speed of the ocean and the speed of the ice itself. So these are kind of fundamental equations you've probably seen. I'm not going to get too much into any equations in my talk because honestly, I have a hard time following that, and then I do my talks that way as well. But what's valuable for you to know is that in the Arctic and the Antarctic, the different dynamic forces can differ in terms of which ones are the most dominant. So air stress and ocean stress are in black and blue here, and you can see that they're kind of the dominant terms in both hemispheres. So we got the Arctic on the left, the Antarctic on the right. But you can see that they differ in the Arctic. They're still the dominant terms, but we also have internal ice stress and somewhat Coriolis force as well impacting the different parts of the momentum equation. In the Antarctic, as I mentioned, we're in free drift, which basically means we just have air stress and ocean stress, and those are the 2 forces that are determining how and where the ice moves. So the internal ice stress and Coriolis are much less important than those other terms. All right, when we think about internal ice stress, we're thinking about the stress within the ice itself, but also how the ice is going to respond to an external force or a stress. So you can imagine here on the left, we have an ice flow. That's the blue thing. It has some length scale L. It's moving along. It runs into this coastline here. And some time later, we find that it now has a length scale of L plus delta L, whatever that is, because the land itself has exerted a stress on the ice. And the strain is relating this change in length here to the stress that it's experiencing. So the stress from the land is causing this ice to deform. It's important to note that volume is conserved, so we're not losing or gaining mass here. But the concentration, like what you would have within your grid cell, that will not be conserved because you might have a grid cell that used to be 100% covered with ice. You get wind that's blowing, pushing it up against the coast, and now it's only going to be 50% covered in ice. But now that ice will be a lot thicker. So if you're looking at CESM outputs, just be aware that volume would be conserved, but ice is not. And there's a lot of continuing research about how we should relate the ice stress to the ice strain rate. What we use, what I think that's valuable for you to know, is CESM uses the elastic viscous plastic EVP scheme. And in this case, we treat ice as a continuum. It can deform elastically, so like a spring flow sometimes that's like viscous, and sometimes have plastic deformation, which means it's permanent in different conditions. I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not an ice dynamicist, so I haven't thought about this part of the code a whole lot. But there are other people we work with within the consortium who this is their focus, and we trade ideas back and forth about improving the code and suggestions about what the best schemes are, and I think that's important to note that any model has a large group of people who work on it and help make it the best it can be. All right, so the next part of the CEIS code that I wanted to bring up is the thermodynamics. So this is what I mentioned might be called ice pack if you've used the 1D part of the model. But it's basically the part of the model that solves for the vertical and lateral melt and growth rates. And so this is a picture here of people taking an ice core, and this is what the core looks like. So you can imagine that what the thermodynamics part of the code is looking at all these vertical, primarily the vertical flux balances and heat transfers. So within CEIS in CESM, we could imagine in any grid cell, you have ice, and we divide that into 8 layers. No matter how thick it is, we have 8 layers of ice. And then we have snow on top of the ice, and that's divided into 3 layers. And the thermodynamics part of the code basically looks at the surface fluxes. So we have short wave fluxes, long wave fluxes, sensible latent heat fluxes. And then you have a conductive flux through the ice from the ocean. And we solve for what this top surface flux balance would be. So is it melting? Would it be growing somehow by the ice? You get more snow and then it got depressed, something like that. We solve for the vertical heat transfer through the ice here. So we have temperatures and salinities at each one of these layers. There's a conductivity. You can see these equations here again. They depend on density, conductivity. In our model, density is constant of both snow and ice. And then we also solve a bottom surface flux balance that depends on the flux of heat from the ocean coming into the ice. Some things to be aware of about how the ice treats, how the ice is treating, some of the ways that the ice treats these fluxes is that the truth of ice structure is that it's not like one, I mentioned there's salt in there, it's not just like solid ice. What you get when you have salt in the ice is these brine channels here where you get super saline ice within these brine channels. Eventually they kind of drain through the ice and you get these like cracks throughout the ice, and that causes it to behave and be deformed differently than say like land ice like glaciers. Within CESM2 and CESM3, the parameterization we use to describe the structure of the sea ice is what's called the mushy layer thermodynamic scheme. And within this, we prognostically determine both the temperature and the salinity profiles throughout the ice using these thermodynamics. We assume that the pockets or the brine channels here are filled with brine, but they're in thermal equilibrium with the ice around them. We assume a salinity-dependent freezing temperature, and the heat capacity and conductivity are functions of the temperature and salinity within the ice. All right, the other part of a couple other parts of the thermodynamics just to be aware of is that the solar radiation parameterization is called the delta Eddington parameterization. So this has again been around for a little while, but many models use it. It has inherent optical properties, so of the ice or the snow itself, and this is how we determine scattering or absorption. So what we do is you calculate a base albedo, and then you can modify this based on the snow grain radius, the temperature of the snow, and how those things would evolve. We also explicitly are able to include absorbers that would be within the ice. So usually that would be like we have dust deposition that can go into the ice. You could include sediment or algae. Those are generally not the largest impacts on your albedo. We also account for melt ponds. I mentioned the snow grain size before, and this is in CESM1 and CESM2. And it'll be in CESM3 also. I didn't update that slide, sorry. We do have a melt pond parameterization. This is being updated for CESM 3, but we have one in CESM 2 as well. It only influences the radiation, and it has a really big impact on surface forcing. So what you're seeing here are test simulations where there's a case run with ponds and one without ponds, so we're looking at the difference here. And in the summer in the Arctic, you can see that including ponds can lead up to like a 10 watt per meter squared difference in how much radiation is being absorbed at the surface. And so that is pretty huge, and that's really gonna affect your sea ice state and your energy balance. So including ponds is really important. We do take into account whether sea ice is deformed or not and how the ponds form, so it's relatively sophisticated. As I mentioned, it's going to be changing in CESM 3 to become more sophisticated. But I think these are the main things for the thermodynamics part of the model that you should just be aware of, that we calculate albedos, we have melt ponds, and that we have a lot of structure within the ice that we're looking at to understand how heat is conducted. All right, then the third part of the sea ice model is what is called an ice thickness distribution. So what you're seeing here is a cross-section that someone took at some point in the Arctic Ocean. And the main thing I want you to take away from this is as you go across, the ice thickness or the keels that you can see vary quite a lot. The ice has a lot of different thicknesses over a relatively small distance. So this is like 10 kilometers long. So what we do with this ice thickness distribution is have this parameterization that can account for this high heterogeneity in the thickness of ice. And it's a probability density function that we solve for. So we have 5 thickness categories. We talked about this a little bit at lunch too. You can have more, but within CESM 5 seems to be enough to resolve the PDF that we want, and it's not too expensive to run. And what we do is we compute the fluxes, so the albedos, the shortwave fluxes, longwave fluxes, turbulent fluxes, conductive fluxes in each of these categories, and then later we merge them based on the fractional area of each category. And we keep track of the tracers, so for example, snow depth, that's what this is meant to show, that there's snow, or the melt pond fraction for each one of these thickness categories. So that means that the way we treat albedo, for example, is actually really sophisticated. So you can imagine you have 5 thickness categories, and we have 3 possible surface types. We have bare ice, snow-covered ice, or ponded ice. And so that means that in each grid cell, we're calculating 15 different albedos for all of those different combinations, and then we merge those based on area. So it's not like we assign an albedo or we calculate it for the whole grid cell. It's actually much more complicated than that because of this subgrid scale parameterization. So this is an equation for the ice thickness distribution. It can change due to growth or melt or convergence or redistribution within the grid cell. This is an example PDF. I'll give some qualitative examples of how this could change in the future, but this is like the probability of ice within these different thickness categories. So you have like a high probability of some very thin or open water, a high probability of first-year ice, a lower probability of multi-year ice, and then it diminishes for really, really thick ice. So you can imagine that if you were in a grid cell and you have mechanical redistribution or convergence of ice here, it's going to come together. You're going to get a ridge. The ridge is going to be thicker than the ice around it. And so what that looks like within our PDF that we solve for is that you're gaining ice in some of these thicker categories as that thin ice gets piled up on one another, and you're losing probability in this thinnest category because it's no longer there because it got smushed together. Similarly, if you had thermodynamic growth, your thickness distributions will change. Here's your ice flow initially, that's the cyan color here, and then imagine that you grow ice within your cell, that's the magenta. So originally this was open ocean, now you're gonna get some really thin ice there. And what you're seeing here is a shift from the open water probability to this very thin ice that grew, say here, and then gains in probability in these parts of the PDF from this thick ice growing. And it is relevant to say that the thicker ice is, the slower it grows, so you would have less thickness growth here than you would say in the thinner ice here. And so that's all part of these conductive fluxes and the basal growth that we calculate. So it's a pretty complex scheme within that. All that being said, sea ice is still not a very expensive part of the CESM. So it's nothing compared to CAM in terms of the cost. All right. So I've gone over those three main components that are in the CESM model, and now I just want to talk about a little bit about some changes that will be implemented for CESM 3, since that's imminently coming out, so many of you will either look at output or maybe run it, just to be aware of. So the first thing that we are adding is something called a flow size distribution that I'll describe in a second. So we talked about the ice thickness distribution, a flow size distribution is similar. And then we've updated a couple of the parameterizations, the melt ponds and the snow, and I'll just talk about those very qualitatively. All right, so a flow size distribution. When you actually fly over sea ice, you can see here that we have a bunch of different discrete flows, and they vary in size a lot. So here's like a really big flow here, and here's a medium-sized flow, and then we got a bunch of little ones here. And from a satellite, you can see that you have the same sort of scale issue where you have very small flows here, and then you can have some bigger flows. And as you go into the pack, you generally tend to have larger flows within the pack ice compared to the marginal ice zone. And you might have a few just discrete flows within the open ocean. In the past, in CESM 2 and in CEIS 5, what we've done before is we just assume a constant flow diameter of 300 meters. So everywhere within the sea ice, we assume that flows are 300 meters in size, but as you can see, that's not actually very realistic. And where it's going to be most impactful is within this, like near the edge of the ice, near the marginal ice zone. So what we've done for CESM 3 is we have a joint flow size and ice thickness distribution. Again, we have the equation for it here. If you're interested, you guys can look back at these slides and read all of these papers. But there's ways that we describe how this would change based on advection of flows, thermodynamic growth, mechanical interactions, or fracture. And why this is relevant is that when you have waves, so if you have wind and then those create waves in the sea ice, it changes the way the ice forms. So here, imagine you have waves. What you end up is with these pancakes of ice that like bump into each other, and they can weld or they can break depending on the size. Whereas if you have very quiescent conditions, you'll just have a nice like flat nihilous sheet of ice. And so within these equations, we think about how a flow might shrink, how it would melt on the edges, say, thermodynamically, or grow thermodynamically based on its size, how flows might weld together, and how if you get a big enough wave and say a flow is like kind of between the waves, it would crack and break into smaller flows. So we have this implemented in CESM 3. We're testing it now. It seems to be giving fairly reasonable results. You can see here the representative radius, so like the average radius per grid cell would be in these yellow colors, it's smaller, in the darker colors, it's larger. And here you can see in the central Arctic where we have pack ice, it's large, and on the edges it's going from this purple to through green to yellow, so it's getting smaller as we get to the ice edge. So this seems very qualitatively reasonable. We have a similar sort of thing happening in the Antarctic. These are relatively old figures. This is something that's like at the bleeding edge of the model, and so we've done some tuning since these figures were made, but we're hoping this will be at least in some of the default CESM 3 runs, maybe not all of them. That's kind of to be determined right now. It is a relatively expensive thing to add. And one of the big challenges we're finding is that we don't have good observations against which to compare it. And so Dave can talk a lot more about this because he was at a workshop last week specifically about this. Another thing that we've done is we've changed melt ponds. So in CESM 2, if we look here, the shaded colors are the albedo within CESM, and then these two lines are observations of albedo throughout the seasonal cycle in 2 different field campaigns, and looks like the albedo is great, we're done, melt ponds must be great. Well, what we found when we looked a little bit closer was that the fraction of melt ponds in the model, again, these shaded colors, is way too high. It's getting up to like above 30 or 40%. And observations show that melt pond fraction doesn't actually get above 20%. So we have ponds that are way too extensive, covering way too much of the ice, but their albedo is also too high, this is in the model, compared to observations. So that means they're pretty thin. They're brighter ponds rather than very thick, dark ponds. And so we have been working on a new parameterization. We delved into the code. One of our former postdocs, David Clemens-Sewell, has worked on this a lot, primarily within IcePack, and now it's in the coupled model. But what we found is that before, when we had a melt pond and it drained, it only drained the thickness changed, but it didn't actually reduce the extent of the pond, so that's why they were way too thick. And so he's changed the parameterization so that when they drain, now they both reduce depth and area, and so we're hoping that this makes the way that we treat melt ponds more realistic. And so what this is showing here is just the observations, and the pond depth are much better in his sea level pond scheme than they were before. And then the last thing that we have added that I think is relevant for everyone here is that there's some more advanced snow physics that have become available through the CEIS consortium through other partners. So it's not like we did all of that development here, but this is one of the benefits of the consortium. We all can share stuff across these different organizations so that we can improve our models, but we don't have to do all the development ourselves. So the parts of this advanced snow physics that we are including are related to the snow redistribution. So when you have wind blowing across the snow in either the Arctic or the Antarctic, that can cause the snow to be compacted. It can also blow some of the snow into leads, and so you lose that snow on top of the sea ice. I think there's a lot of debate still about what happens when that goes into a lead. Does it immediately refreeze into very thin ice? That's beyond what we need to worry about here, but we've included some of these physics here within the model. That's partly because we know that snow is super important for how well the sea ice model, how actual real sea ice in the real world and within the model respond to different forcings. So I think that's it. In the slides that are going to be posted, I put a number of slides about CESM2 sea ice validation that have some of the major results and references for the different polar climate and sea ice in the Arctic and the Antarctic. So if you're excited about that, you can look into those. But I think I am done talking about this, and I'm happy to take questions.
Questions for Alice?
I'm curious if you have any guesses as to the main factors responsible for like the large reduction in sea ice over Antarctica in 2023, like if you attribute it almost entirely to ocean heat transport or atmospheric heat transport.
So like in reality, not in the model?
Yeah.
As I said, there's a lot of debate about this within the community. My sense is that there's kind of been a shift in dominant drivers. So in the past, it was more the atmosphere. So that big expansion period that I showed, where it was like expanding, that seems to be related to winds and the ice being advected farther north. And the ocean wasn't warm enough that it was melting all of the ice that got advected northward. It seems like what happened after 2016, and especially in 2023, is related to ocean heat content, and maybe there's more heat coming up from above, and there might also be the 2023 event in particular. The year before also had a really low amount of ice, and so there could have been a lot more residual heat in the upper mixed layer that prevented ice from forming as early, and so that's more of like an albedo effect going on. I think the jury's still out about whether there's like a large scale shift in the ocean circulation and heat content or not. But some of the people here are looking into that with models and trying to see what we can learn from models.
Yeah, I might miss this, but what is the main reason for improved melt pond parameterization? Is it related to improve the surface velocities, etc.?
Yeah.
If so, do you see like big changes compared to the old one?
I mean, in general, that's a great question about modeling in general. Like, why improve the model if it looks reasonable? And I think some of it has to do with, you're like, oh, the albedo looks great. And then when you start to look into it, like what's actually driving that seasonal evolution, and then you find out that that doesn't look very physical. You want your model to be as realistic and like physically replicating physically observed processes as you can. So that's part of the reason we developed that. It will also impact, that surface energy budget. And so I think those are the main reasons for trying to improve it, even though the overall albedo looked good. But because we care about some of that subgrid scale variability, under like being able to actually represent the melt ponds better is important to us in terms of understanding how thickness is going to change, or the timing of when the different transitions and the timing of the melt season, stuff like that.
So how the CSM treats sea ice and ice?
Say that, how does CESM3?
Sea ice and ice shelf.
We don't have active ice shelves in CESM, so like where an ice shelf would be is just like a land boundary that the ocean and sea ice like can butt up against, but we don't have active like interaction or ice shelf.
So is it considered like ocean or like land?
It's considered like land.
Land.
Yeah, and we have fluxes from those, like freshwater fluxes. There's again debate about like, I think they're coming in at the surface, and in a real ice shelf, they'd be coming in from below and maybe like spreading out at depth rather than up at the surface. So they're not necessarily the most realistic, but they seem to be okay for now.
So the interaction is like parameterized.
Yeah, I would say there's like, no, it's just like a land boundary other than the runoff aspect. And I don't know if those are very realistic runoffs compared to, I think they've tried to base that on Antarctic runoff or Greenland runoff, but it's not necessarily, there's a lot of unknowns about runoff around Antarctica.
I know that in POP there are some problems with the way that dense shelf water is formed around Antarctica. Is that primarily an issue with sea ice representation, or is it an ocean problem, or both?
I think it's more of an ocean problem. I mean, you can, if you're not having sea ice form in the right spot, then you could have like this highly saline water not going at depth at the right spot. But I think it's more about the ocean and resolution of the ocean and like how you get the mixing of this high salinity shelf water with like the circumpolar deep water, and that's what forms the Antarctic bottom water. So I would not say that's an ice problem. We'll push that on them.
And more in the beginning of the talk, you showed in the dynamics part, basically, you showed the stresses for the Arctic and the Antarctic. And it was like a magnitude of about 10 difference.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned for the internal stresses, it was due to the being enclosed by the land.
Yeah.
But is it the same reason for the wind stress factor, like the wind stress and the ocean stress? Is like for all of those is the reason that it's enclosed in land or not?
I mean, I think whether it's enclosed in land or not ends up like propagating throughout the whole pack. So like if you're bounded by land on say like 3/4 of your circle, which is basically what the Arctic is like, then even if you're like in the central part of the Arctic and not directly touching land, that ice is touching ice that is touching ice that's touching land. And so having those internal stresses between those ice flows and then ultimately, the stress between the flow and land is going to affect that whole pack differently than it does in Antarctica, where it's just like, oh, I can go as far north as I want, and then it melts and dies.
Kind of like a follow-up on your previous answers, like how do you account for the late freeze and early melt in the Arctic with the rapid warming?
So, I mean, within the model, the ocean, so like when you have a grid cell, we know the fractional coverage of sea ice, we know the albedo of the open ocean versus the sea ice, and so you can calculate how much of that radiation is absorbed in the surface ocean, and then that'll accumulate as ocean heat content. And if you have too much ocean heat content, the ocean will be too warm to form frazzle ice as you get towards fall and it gets cold, and so you need to wait until the ocean cools down enough that you'll hit the freezing point. And so if you've had more open ocean throughout most of the summer, it's going to be a lot warmer water near the surface where the ice forms, and so you'll have a delayed freeze up. And we have all of those processes in the model, and I think that's in reality also what's causing delayed freeze ups and stuff like that. The earlier melt is often about like the snow is thicker or the snow is thinner these days and the ice is thinner, and so as it melts, like you still have this transition to like the snow melts and then you get melt ponds and then you have bare ice and like, you're melting from below and all of this. But when the ice is thinner, you can melt it away sooner in the summer than you could before.
Yeah, I wonder the thermodynamic part of the snow and ice and how ice have 8 layers, and then how does that work for the shear flow in different layers, and then also having the.
Do you mean like shear like?
Yeah, shear between each layers, and then also the horizontal and vertical.
That's a great question. We don't even worry about like horizontal shear within a column. We just assume once it's in a column, like all of that ice is just gonna stay in itself, and it's like with ice in adjacent grid cells where you would have shear or convergence or divergence, but like once you have a single column, we don't worry about the sub-grid scale, like shear within a particular vertical transect device.
I have a question regarding the flow size distribution and the ice thickness distribution, like how they come together. Like, I mean, you have a grid cell and then you have like I guess you first define how many sizes you have like for the flows, and then you look within one flow, like the ice thickness distribution, or is it the other way around? Or
I mean, they're like together, so instead of it being like a 1D, like 5 thickness categories, you have your 5 thickness categories, and then you have, say, your 5 flow size categories, and so for each thickness category, you'd have all 5 flow sizes, or you can imagine it as one thickness category, you have all 5 flow sizes. So, we're increasing the number of degrees of freedom a lot by adding this joint distribution.
Okay.
So there's unlikely to be many like really, or you could look at like what the probability is of a very small but very thick flow versus a very large and very thick flow. So you can look at all of that.
So you have the different thicknesses, and then you were also saying you have snow versus no snow. Is the assumption that the ratio of snow to ice within a given column is consistent? That's always the same ratio?
Not necessarily. I mean, we have precipitation on the snow, and that's what, or on the ice, and that's what determines the snow depth. And so it's not like we have a fixed ratio that we must always adhere to, but you can imagine, so within CESM, the ice it's not embedded within the ocean, so it's not like, it's kind of like floating above the ocean. But in the snow ice formation part of the thermodynamics, we do look at like, okay, if we had ice of this thickness and snow above it, and we have the densities, like, is this enough that it would depress the surface of the ice below sea level, in which case then you freeze the amount of snow up to where it would now be floating.
So you mentioned about the PDF where you try to adjust the PDF. So is there any standard way, like you can choose the bin size? Because if you choose the bin size, the PDF looks totally different. So how do you do that?
So that's right. So we use the 5 categories and we have set bin sizes for those. A long time ago, well before I came here, which was, I don't know, maybe like 15 years ago plus, when the ice thickness distribution was first implemented, people did a lot of testing about like how many bins are the right number of bins and what sizes should they be. And the 5 that we use is based on those tests a long time ago, where we felt like the 5 categories and the bin widths, you can imagine, like what thickness ranges were in each one, was sufficient to resolve a reasonable PDF and computationally efficient enough that it was worth it. So we didn't want just like 3 thickness categories. 5 seemed to be enough that we could resolve it. 3 was too little. 20 is not giving us any more value for the extra costs to the model. Not all that testing was done before I came, so as long as I've been here, there's always been the 5, and I think a lot of modeling centers that I know of also use the 5 based on those sensitivity tests. But there have been a couple simulations, and I know people who've done simulations where they increased it, and I don't think it dramatically impacted the results. It just makes the model cost more, and so that's always a concern too. And I mean, one thing we're running into with the wave ice part of the model for this flow size distribution is that it costs a significant amount more because you have a lot of iterations for the flow breaking part of it. And so, like I said, it still doesn't cost as much as CAM, but it's costing enough that it's becoming a little bit of a concern. So it's like, you always have this balance of like, okay, can we get away with 10 iterations or do we really need 100? Like, what's gonna give us a reasonable answer and not leak energy or whatever? Versus like, we want it to be as good as it can be and now it costs as much as CAM, and the software engineers are like, no, absolutely not.